Hey there, tonight we're exploring the life of Galileo Galilei, where the truth is that his quest to map the stars nearly cost him everything. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the bustling streets of 16th century Pisa, Italy, a young Galileo Galilei was probably more fascinated by the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestone than the grandeur of the Renaissance architecture surrounding him. Born in 1564, Galileo was a kid with an insatiable curiosity, and thankfully he wasn't too distracted by the fact that his family finances were about as stable as some of his later experiments. Galileo's father, Vincenzo Galilei, was a musician and music theorist, which is a polite way of saying he didn't exactly rake in the florins. The Galileis were constantly pinching pennies, and young Galileo quickly learned that a career in music might not pay the bills. So, he turned his attention to the more promising field of mathematics and mechanics. After all, why play the lute when you could play with the laws of nature? Now, Pisa in the late 1500 was a city that wore its quirks on its sleeve, or rather, on its famous leaning tower. And it was from this very tower that Galileo, with his usual flair for the dramatic and a healthy disregard for conventional wisdom, would conduct one of his most legendary experiments. You see, back in Galileo's day, the prevailing wisdom, courtesy of Aristotle, was that heavier objects fell faster than lighter ones. It sounds intuitive, right? But Galileo, ever the skeptic, decided to test this theory himself. Picture Galileo standing atop the leaning tower, which even then had a tilt more pronounced than a curious puppy's head. Imagine him with two spheres of different weights, one heavy, one light, in his hands. Legend has it that he dropped them simultaneously, and to the astonishment of onlookers below, both hit the ground at the same time. This was a classic case of trust, but verify, centuries before Ronald Reagan made it a thing. Galileo's experiment was simple yet profound. It was a literal drop-the-mic moment that challenged centuries of scientific thought. Of course, some of the finer details of this story might be more fiction than fact. Did Galileo actually drop the weights from the tower? Historians argue about this like sports fans over a dubious referee call. What's more likely is that he conducted more controlled experiments using inclined planes. But let's not let the truth get in the way of a good story. The image of Galileo single-handedly debunking Aristotle from the leaning tower is too good to resist, and it certainly paints a vivid picture of his rebellious spirit. Galileo's penchant for questioning authority wasn't just a quirky personality trait. It was a necessity in a time when the Catholic Church pretty much ran the show. The Church held a tight grip on knowledge, and challenging its doctrines was akin to poking a bear with a stick. Yet Galileo's mathematical prowess and mechanical ingenuity was so compelling that he couldn't resist the urge to poke. The University of Pisa, where Galileo eventually studied, was a hotbed of intellectual activity, but it wasn't exactly a bastion of free thought. Students were expected to regurgitate the teachings of Aristotle without question. But Galileo, with the defiance of a teenager told to clean his room, decided to do things differently. He was the kind of student who wouldn't just ask why the sky is blue. He'd figure out how to prove it. His love for mathematics blossomed here, and though he initially enrolled as a medical student, because what Italian mother doesn't want her son to be a doctor, he quickly shifted his focus to mathematics and philosophy. This was a bold move, given the economic realities of the time. Mathematicians weren't exactly rolling in dough, and Galileo's family could have used every extra ducat. But Galileo was driven by a passion that was impervious to such practical concerns. In the realm of 16th century academia, Galileo was a bit of a maverick. He'd argue with professors, challenge established theories, and generally make a nuisance of himself. But his brilliance was undeniable. He was like the kid in class who always had the right answer, but also made you laugh with a well-timed quip about the teacher's hairdo. He was that rare combination of intellect and charisma, and it set him apart from his peers. Despite his family's financial struggles, Galileo's talent couldn't be ignored. He caught the attention of patrons who valued his intellect, and he began to make a name for himself in academic circles. But let's not romanticize it too much. The path to scientific stardom was hardly paved with gold. Galileo had to hustle, taking on teaching gigs that were more about survival than prestige. Yet, Galileo's early years in Pisa were formative, setting the stage for the groundbreaking work that would follow. This was a time when the seeds of his future discoveries were being planted. It was a period of intellectual ferment, where Galileo was sharpening the tools he would later use to slice through the fog of medieval thought. And as he stood atop the Leaning Tower, contemplating the mysteries of gravity and motion, Galileo was on the brink of something monumental. His story was just beginning, and the world was about to change in ways that even he couldn't fully predict. But for now, let's leave young Galileo there, poised on the precipice of history, with the weight of both heavy and light spheres, and the future of science in his hands. As Galileo stood atop the Leaning Tower with the weight of scientific revolution literally in his hands, the wheels of history were already in motion, carrying him towards his next adventure, Padua. Picture this city as a vibrant hub of academia and commerce, where ideas flowed as freely as the wine in local taverns. In 1592, Galileo packed up his experiments and skepticism and headed to the University of Padua, a place known for its intellectual freedom, or at least as free as one could be without irking the church. Padua was a breath of fresh air for Galileo, who felt stifled by the rigid doctrines of Pisa. Here, he was appointed as the chair of mathematics, a position that paid him a modest salary of 180 florins a year. Not exactly a fortune, enough to keep the wolves at bay and the ink flowing on his parchment. Galileo was essentially a one-man Renaissance fair, juggling teaching, inventing, and of course, a fair share of academic rivalries. His lectures were a hit, drawing crowds eager to hear his unconventional take on the universe, a mix of sharp intellect and biting wit that left his students both enlightened and entertained. Now, let's talk about one of Galileo's most spectacular feats, the telescope. Contrary to popular belief, Galileo didn't invent the telescope, he perfected it. The original design came from a Dutch spectacle maker, Hans Lippershey, in 1608. But Galileo, with the ingenuity of a tech startup founder, saw its potential beyond being a mere novelty. By 1609, he had crafted his own version, which magnified objects up to 20 times. Imagine the excitement of looking through a homemade contraption and seeing the moons of Jupiter for the first time. It was like the universe had handed him a backstage pass to the cosmos. Galileo was no fool. He knew he had something extraordinary on his hands. So, in a move that would make any modern entrepreneur proud, he pitched his telescope to the Venetian Senate. Picture Galileo standing in front of a room full of skeptical senators, extolling the virtues of his invention. The telescope, he argued, would be invaluable for spotting enemy ships long before they reached Venetian shores. The senators, convinced by Galileo's demonstration and perhaps a touch of his charm, agreed to buy it. They gifted him a lifetime tenure at the university and tripled his salary to 1,000 florins, a princely sum that ensured Galileo could afford more than just the occasional loaf of bread. Yet, while Galileo was busy making astronomical discoveries, he wasn't immune to the comedic missteps that often accompany scientific brilliance. Take, for instance, his attempts to determine longitude at sea using his telescope. The idea was sound in theory, but practically impossible with the technology of the time. Imagine trying to steady a telescope on a rocking ship while simultaneously charting celestial bodies. It was a bit like trying to paint a masterpiece while riding a roller coaster. The endeavor failed, but it didn't dampen Galileo's spirit or his reputation. Speaking of reputation, Galileo was not one to shy away from conflict. In Padua, he often found himself at odds with academic rivals, who were less than thrilled with his challenges to established norms. These intellectual skirmishes were as much about ego as they were about science. At a time when questioning the status quo could land you in a heap of trouble, Galileo's defiant stance was both brave and reckless. He was the kind of scientist who would rather court controversy than compromise his principles. Now, let's zoom in on those first peeks through Galileo's telescope, which offered a view of the cosmos that was nothing short of revolutionary. Through his lens, the moon was no longer a smooth, mystical orb, but a rugged landscape of craters and mountains. Jupiter wasn't a solitary giant, but a world with its own entourage of moons: Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, orbiting like cosmic dancers. These revelations were like the universe whispering secrets into Galileo's ear, secrets that would forever alter humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. Galileo meticulously documented his findings, publishing them in 1610 in a short treatise titled Sidereus Nuncius, or The Starry Messenger. This little book was a bombshell, exploding the old Aristotelian view of a perfect, unchanging universe. The celestial bodies were dynamic, imperfect, and most importantly, observable. Galileo had given the world a new lens, literally and figuratively, through which to view the heavens. And while this made him a hero to some, it also painted a target on his back for those who saw his discoveries as heretical. In Padua, Galileo's star was rising, but so too were the stakes. His work was laying the groundwork for a scientific revolution, but it was also setting him on a collision course with powerful institutions. The Church, with its celestial spheres and divine order, wasn't exactly thrilled about a universe that looked more like a work in progress than a finished masterpiece. But Galileo, for the provocateur, seemed undeterred by the brewing storm. He was like a chess player, making bold moves while the rest of the world struggled to keep up with the game. As he peered through his telescope, Galileo was not just observing the heavens. He was challenging humanity to rethink its place in the universe. His discoveries were a call to arms for a new age of reason, a clarion call that echoed through the halls of academia and beyond. Yet, for all his genius, Galileo was still a man of his time, navigating the tricky waters of patronage, politics, and personal ambition. And so, as Galileo gazed up at the stars, he was not only charting new worlds, but also charting the course of his own destiny. His journey was far from over, and the path ahead was fraught with both opportunity and peril. But for now, let's leave him there, on the cusp of greatness, with a telescope in hand, and the universe awaiting his curiosity. The stage was set for the next act in Galileo's remarkable story, and the world was about to change in ways that even he couldn't fully imagine. As Galileo stood on the brink of discovery and disaster, his gaze turned toward Florence, the cultural epicenter of Italy, and perhaps the only place where someone could comfortably juggle genius and controversy. In 1610, armed with his telescope and a burgeoning reputation, he took up residence at the court of the Medici family. Now, the Medici were the kind of power players who could turn a pauper into a prince with the stroke of a quill, or a scientist into a superstar. They were Florence's unofficial royals, and Galileo, ever the opportunist, knew a patronage like this was worth its weight in gold, or more accurately, ducats. Galileo's first move was to name Jupiter's moons after the Medici children, a sycophantic gesture that might seem a tad over the top today, but was sheer genius in 17th century politics. It was like naming a star after a Hollywood mogul's kid, instant cachet. The Medici were thrilled, and Galileo was rewarded with a cushy position as chief mathematician and philosopher to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo Roman II. And let's be honest, who wouldn't want to be the official brainiac to a family that practically invented the Renaissance? But with great power comes great scrutiny, and Galileo's vocal support of the Copernican model, that audacious notion that the Earth revolved around the sun, was about to land him in hot water. Copernicus had postulated this heliocentric model back in 1543, but Galileo's telescopic evidence gave it a fresh, unsettling credibility. Cue the Catholic Church, an institution not exactly known for its flexibility, which saw Galileo's findings as a direct challenge to the geocentric view endorsed by Scripture. In their eyes, the sun wasn't just the center of the solar system. It was the center of a celestial hierarchy that put Earth, and by extension, humanity, at the heart of God's creation. Galileo, however, was less concerned with theological implications and more with empirical evidence. He'd seen the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, the sunspots, cosmic phenomena that stubbornly refused to fit the geocentric mold. It was as if the universe was playing a cosmic prank, whispering truths to Galileo that contradicted centuries of dogma. But these truths were as dangerous as they were enlightening. Galileo was walking a tightrope, balancing the awe of discovery against the ire of orthodoxy. In 1660, the Church formally prohibited the Copernican theory, labeling it foolish and absurd in philosophy. Galileo was summoned to Rome, a city where dreams of scientific progress often collided with the brick wall of ecclesiastical authority. The Church's stance was clear. Galileo could discuss Copernican ideas as a mathematical hypothesis, but not as a factual account of the universe. It was a classic case of you can think it, but don't you dare say it. The kind of logic that could make any scientist's head spin faster than the Earth allegedly did around the sun. Galileo, ever the master of rhetoric and reason, managed to navigate these treacherous waters with a mix of diplomacy and defiance. He returned to Florence, chastened but not silenced. For a while, he focused on safer subjects, like the nature of tides, which he mistakenly attributed to the Earth's rotation, a rare misstep in his otherwise stellar intellectual journey. But the call of the cosmos was too strong, and Galileo couldn't resist the gravitational pull of heliocentric truth. By 1623, fortune seemingly favored the bold once more when Pope Urban Roman VIII ascended the papal throne. A man of letters and an acquaintance of Galileo, Urban Roman VIII seemed a more progressive pontiff. Galileo seized the moment, publishing dialogue concerning the two chief world systems in 1632. This work, presented as a debate between proponents of the Ptolemaic and Copernican systems, was a masterclass in subtlety, or not so subtle, depending on which side of the debate you stood. The book was a sensation, a literary firestorm that reignited the heliocentric controversy. Its dialogue format cleverly disguised Galileo's support for Copernicanism, but the Church wasn't buying it. The character of Simplicio, the defender of the geocentric view, was a little too simian for comfort, and many saw it as a veiled jab at the Pope himself. Urban Roman VIII, feeling betrayed, turned on his once-favored intellectual sparring partner. It was as if Galileo had RSVP'd to a Vatican gala and shown up in a "Copernicus was right" t-shirt. In 1633, Galileo was summoned to Rome again, this time for a trial before the Roman Inquisition. The charges were serious, vehement suspicion of heresy. The trial was less about science and more a theatrical display of power, a reminder that the Church was the ultimate arbiter of truth. Galileo, now in his late 60s, weary and ill but still intellectually formidable. Yet even his eloquence couldn't sway the Inquisition, which demanded he recant his support for the heliocentric model. Under threat of torture, a common persuasion technique of the era, Galileo recanted, uttering the infamous "E per si muove," or "and yet it moves," only in the whispers of legend, not the courtroom record. The phrase captures the tension between Galileo's public concession and his private conviction, a testament to the enduring power of truth in the face of dogma. It's a myth that persists because it encapsulates the spirit of scientific inquiry. The earth keeps spinning, no matter what the powers that be decree. The Inquisition condemned Galileo to house arrest, a sentence that might sound cushy until you realize it was a life sentence, confining him to his villa in Arcetri near Florence. Imagine being a man who had once gazed into the cosmos, now confined to the terrestrial limits of his home. It was a gilded cage, complete with a view of the stars, but no freedom to explore them. Despite these constraints, Galileo's mind continued to orbit around the mysteries of the universe. He spent his remaining years working on two new sciences, a treatise on kinematics and strength of materials, which laid the groundwork for classical mechanics. It was smuggled out of Italy and published in the Netherlands, a testament to the enduring reach of his intellect even from under house arrest. His resilience was as impressive as his discoveries, a reminder that the human spirit is as uncontainable as the universe itself. Galileo's struggle was more than a personal battle. It was emblematic of the broader conflict between science and religion, a wrestling match that would echo through the ages. He wasn't just a scientist. He was a provocateur, a rebel with a cause, challenging the status quo with the audacity of a man who refused to be boxed in by the narrow confines of his time. As the world turned, so did the tides of history, slowly vindicating Galileo's vision of a universe in motion. And there he remained, a man ahead of his time, watching from his villa as the world slowly caught up with the truths he had glimpsed through his telescope. The stars continued their dance, indifferent to the squabbles of humanity, and Galileo, though silenced, had set their story in motion. His tale was far from over, and the reverberations of his discoveries would continue to shake the foundations of knowledge long after his own orbit had ended. Even though Galileo was confined to his villa, his mind was anything but imprisoned. It's like being grounded, but still managing to sneak out through the window of your imagination. Galileo continued to work on his most enduring contributions to physics, the laws of motion. Imagine the audacity of a man who, while under house arrest, decided to redefine how we understand the universe's dance. Now, Galileo wasn't just lounging around in his slippers, sipping wine, and watching the Tuscan sun dip below the horizon. No, he was busy penning what would become two new sciences, a work so groundbreaking it was like dropping a scientific bombshell on the status quo. Written between 1638 and 1642, it was a deep dive into the mechanics of motion and strength of materials, laying the foundation for the classical physics that Isaac Newton would later ride to fame on. Galileo's work in kinematics, or the study of motion without considering its causes, was particularly groundbreaking. He was the first to clearly articulate the principle of inertia, which states that an object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an external force. Sounds familiar? Newton certainly thought so when he borrowed it as the first of his three laws of motion. Galileo also posited that the distance covered by a falling object is proportional to the square of the time it has been falling. In less nerdy terms, he realized that acceleration due to gravity is constant, a realization that, even today, makes physics students groan during exams. Galileo's villa became a kind of clandestine scientific workshop, where he tinkered with experiments that proved his theories. He'd roll balls down inclined planes, timing their descent with his pulse, an act that was both medieval in method and modern in insight. His findings were written with such clarity and wit that even his opponents had to grudgingly admire the craftsmanship. Two new sciences were smuggled out of Italy and published in the tolerant haven of the Dutch Republic in 1638, a move that would make even the most daring of modern whistleblowers nod in approval. But let's not forget the human side of Galileo, the man who, even in confinement, managed to maintain his sense of humor. His correspondence with fellow scientists was peppered with wry observations and thinly veiled jabs at the ecclesiastical powers that be. He wrote letters full of sarcasm and subtle defiance, as if daring the Inquisition to catch him in a verbal misstep. Picture Galileo, quill in hand, chuckling to himself as he crafted yet another barb against the intellectual rigidity of his time. One of his most amusing exchanges was with a fellow scientist named Giovanni Battista Riccioli. Riccioli was a Jesuit priest and a formidable astronomer in his own right, but he wasn't exactly on board with all of Galileo's ideas. In their correspondence, Galileo would occasionally slip in a cheeky comment about the Church's unwavering stance on celestial matters. It was like watching two chess masters play a game where the real prize was not victory, but the pithiest comeback. Yet, for all his wit and wisdom, Galileo's later years were not all scientific triumphs and clever wordplay. He suffered from debilitating arthritis, and tragically went completely blind in 1638. Imagine the cruel irony of a man who had once gazed into the cosmos, now unable to see the very stars he had spent a lifetime understanding. But even blindness couldn't dim his intellectual fire. He continued to dictate his ideas to loyal assistants, his mind as sharp as ever, cutting through the darkness with insights that would light the way for future generations. The economic context of Galileo's time was also a significant factor in his work. House arrest meant he was cut off from the financial support of wealthy patrons like the Medici, forcing him to rely on the goodwill of friends and the meager returns from his published works. Yet, in a way, this economic hardship fueled his creativity, pushing him to refine ideas that wouldn't just survive, but thrive in the marketplace of ideas. Galileo's sly defiance against censorship and his ability to find humor in adversity are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In a world where speaking truth to power could get you silenced, literally or metaphorically, he found ways to let his ideas free, like doves escaping from a cage. His later life was a masterclass in the art of subversion. where he turned even the limits of his confinement into a stage for intellectual rebellion. And so, Galileo's legacy was sealed not just in the annals of science, but in the very way we view the world, a place where questioning authority is not just a right, but a duty. His story is a reminder that even when the walls close in, the mind can soar. Galileo's villa may have been his prison, but his ideas were the keys to a universe no cell could contain. As history would show, the real revolution wasn't just in the stars. It was in the way we dared to think about them. So, while Galileo's body was confined to his villa, his mind was gallivanting through the cosmos, leaving behind a legacy that would eventually set the world spinning in a whole new direction. Flash forward to today, and Galileo's scientific footprints are firmly etched in the annals of astronomy and physics. It's like the guy wrote the first few chapters of a book that Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein couldn't resist finishing. Galileo's work in kinematics and his telescope-driven revelations were the seeds of modern science. He didn't just peek into the heavens. He opened the floodgates for a deluge of inquiry that dared to question the celestial status quo. His principle of inertia, the idea that objects keep doing whatever they're doing until something else makes them stop, was a revelation that eventually found its way into Newton's laws of motion. Galileo essentially handed Newton the scientific baton, saying, "Here, take this and run with it." And run Newton did, all the way to the Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, which built upon the groundwork Galileo had laid down. Then there's the way Galileo's story is told today, a narrative that's as entertaining as it is educational. From operas to memes, the man has become a cultural icon. Who would have thought that a guy who spent his twilight years under house arrest would one day be the protagonist of a play or the punchline of an internet joke? Take Bertolt Brecht's play, Life of Galileo, which debuted in 1943. It's a dramatic retelling that frames Galileo's conflict with the Church as an eternal struggle between science and authority. It's like watching a chess game where the pieces are ideology and innovation, and Galileo is the knight making all the bold moves. And let's not forget how Galileo's story has infiltrated the digital age. Yes, folks, we're talking about memes. On the internet, Galileo is the patron saint of rebellion against ignorance, with images depicting him as everything from a frustrated teacher facepalming over bad science to a hipster astronomer with the caption, "I was into heliocentrism before it was cool." It's a testament to how his legacy continues to resonate, proving that a well-timed eye roll at dogma is always in vogue. But beyond the theater lights and pixelated humor, Galileo's true legacy is in the way he transformed our approach to science. He championed the idea that observation and experimentation were the keys to understanding the universe, a concept that would become the backbone of the scientific method. His insistence on empirical evidence over philosophical speculation was a radical shift from the Aristotelian principles that had dominated academia for centuries. In essence, Galileo's work was a declaration of intellectual independence, a revolution that unfolded not with muskets and cannons, but with telescopes and inclined planes. Yet, it's crucial to acknowledge the economic and political currents that shaped Galileo's life and work. In a world where the Church wielded immense power, challenging the status quo was a risky endeavor. Galileo's need to navigate the treacherous waters of patronage and ecclesiastical scrutiny speaks to the reality of science as a profession not just of pure inquiry, but of survival. He had to be both a visionary and a shrewd operator, understanding that funding and favor were as critical as formulas and findings. Today, the vindication of Galileo's ideas is complete, though it took a few centuries for the Church to catch up. It wasn't until 1992, yes, you heard that right, the year of grunge and floppy disks, that Pope John Paul Roman II formally acknowledged the Church's error in condemning Galileo. It's like getting an RSVP to a party centuries late, but hey, better late than never, right? This belated apology was more than a historical footnote. It was a recognition of the enduring power of truth over tradition, a nod to the fact that sometimes the earth really does move, regardless of what dogma might say. Galileo's saga is a reminder that true genius isn't just about seeing what others can't. It's about having the courage to act on that vision, even when the world insists otherwise. His journey from Pisa to Padua and beyond was a testament to the power of perseverance and the inevitability of progress. In a universe that spins on its axis, Galileo's legacy is a fixed point, a beacon of scientific inquiry that continues to light the way for those daring enough to look beyond the horizon. In conclusion, Galileo's life was a cosmic ballet of intellect and ideology, set against a backdrop of Renaissance intrigue and ecclesiastical authority. His work laid the groundwork for modern science, challenging humanity to rethink its place in the universe. And as history has shown, his ideas have stood the test of time, proving that while the stars may change, the brilliance of Galileo's mind shines on, illuminating the path for generations of stargazers and truth-seekers alike. So here's to Galileo, the man who dared to turn his gaze skyward, and in doing so, forever changed our view of the heavens and ourselves. Ever found yourself complaining about the chill in the air as you dig out your winter coat from the closet? Well, buckle up, because we're about to time travel back to a world where that chill might just laugh in your face and slap you with a frozen fish. Welcome to the pre-colonial winters of North America, where Native American tribes didn't just survive, they thrived, despite Mother Nature's best attempts to turn them into human popsicles. First stop, geography. North America is a vast expanse of land, and if you think your local weather guy has it rough predicting a week out, imagine trying to make sense of the climate here. We're talking about everything from the icy grip of the Arctic in the north to the blustery plains further south. The Northeast, for instance, where tribes like the Iroquois and Algonquin called home, didn't exactly roll out the red carpet come winter. No, it rolled out a blanket of snow several feet deep, with temperatures that could plummet to a bone-chilling -30 degrees Fahrenheit. That's colder than a snowman's handshake, folks. Now you might be thinking, how on earth did they manage? The answer, my friends, is a mix of ingenuity, community spirit, and a touch of gallows humor. It's not like they had a Home Depot down the road to stock up on space heaters. Instead, they had to make do with what nature provided. And nature, as you might guess, wasn't always generous. Take firewood, for example. In the dense forests of the Northeast, where the trees were both a blessing and a curse, gathering firewood was a full-time job. And we're not talking about a few logs to keep the fireplace cozy. We're talking about enough wood to keep the longhouses, those communal living spaces, warm through the night. Picture a longhouse, a structure sometimes over 100 feet in length, shared by multiple families, each with their own fire. You better believe they kept those fires roaring, because frostbite wasn't just a threat. It was practically a certainty if those flames died down. But firewood wasn't just about warmth. It was about survival, plain and simple. Without it, cooking food would be a nightmare, and forget about drying wet clothes or keeping spirits high. So, tribes developed sophisticated systems for collecting and storing wood, knowing full well that a well-stocked pile could mean the difference between life and death. Of course, if you ran out, you'd have to brave the elements to gather more. Imagine the grumbling about that chore. Now, let's talk about food. If you think your pantry looks bare after a week of neglect, consider the challenge of feeding an entire community with zero chance of a grocery store run. Native tribes knew that hunting and gathering were key, but winter wasn't exactly prime time for either. So, what did they do? They planned ahead, because no one likes a winter surprise, especially when it involves an empty stomach. Before the first snowflake even thought about falling, tribes would preserve food for the cold months. They smoked meats and dried fruits, storing them in pits or elevated caches to keep them safe from scavengers, both animal and human. Corn, beans, and squash, the legendary three sisters of native agriculture, were staples. These hardy crops, once harvested, were dried and stored to be used in stews that could warm the body and soul on even the coldest nights. And if you think this sounds like a scene from a romantic survivalist novel, let's debunk that myth right now. Sure, it's nice to imagine a cozy communal life, everyone gathered around a fire sharing stories. But reality was often much harsher. Starvation was a real threat, and hunting trips could be grueling, dangerous endeavors. Hunters would venture out into the wild for days, sometimes returning empty-handed or not at all. That's a reality check for anyone who's ever grumbled about a long day at the office. Speaking of harsh realities, let's not forget the role of clothing. Forget your fashionable puffer jacket or insulated boots. Native tribes relied on animal skins, carefully prepared and sewn into garments that could withstand the worst that winter threw their way. Deer, beaver, and even bear pelts were transformed into warm cloaks and leggings. And while these might sound like the height of rugged chic today, back then, they were the difference between a brisk walk and a death march. The materials used were practical, sure, but they were also a testament to the deep respect and understanding these tribes had of their environment. Nothing went to waste, and each piece of clothing was crafted with an eye towards functionality and durability. They didn't have the luxury of fast fashion. Every item was a labor of love and survival. And just to add a little twist of irony, let's remember that the very animals providing warmth also provided the food. It's a cycle of life that's as harsh as it is fascinating. But let's not get too carried away with admiration just yet. There's a reason why gallows humor was part of the survival strategy. When you're facing a blizzard that could freeze the eyelashes off a statue, sometimes all you can do is laugh. And Native Americans did just that. They developed stories and legends, often with a humorous twist, to keep morale high and spirits unbroken. Because when you're huddled around a fire with your community, sometimes a good laugh is as vital as the warmth. In the end, these tribes didn't just endure. They thrived because they adapted. They learned to read the land and its patterns, to predict the weather in ways that would make your local meteorologist blush. They understood that survival was a communal effort, where every member played a crucial role. And while we might romanticize their resilience today, it's worth remembering that their survival was a testament to human ingenuity and sheer tenacity. So, next time you grumble about having to scrape ice off your car windshield, spare a thought for those who faced winters with nothing but their wits, their community, and a bit of gallows humor. Because if they could laugh in the face of sub-zero temperatures and keep the fire burning, maybe we can too, at least metaphorically. Stay tuned for more tales from the frosty past. As we delve further into the frosty chronicles of Native American survival, let's get cozy with the idea that these tribes were the original preppers, minus the doomsday podcasts and underground bunkers, of course. The strategy was simple yet genius. Preparation was everything. And this wasn't just a weekend DIY project. It was a full-blown lifestyle commitment with a level of dedication that would make your New Year's resolution look like a casual suggestion. Let's start with stockpiling food. If you think your fridge after a Costco run is impressive, think again. Tribes like the Iroquois and the Sioux were the masters of food storage, and they didn't even have a single Tupperware container. They dried meats, fish, and fruits with precision that would make a Michelin chef blush. But that was just the beginning. They also utilized something called a pit cache, which sounds like a trendy new diet, but was actually a subterranean storage solution. These pits were lined with grass and bark to keep moisture out, and sealed tight with clay or stones. Forget your fancy vacuum-sealed bags. This was old-school preservation at its finest. And you know what? It worked. Food stored this way could last for months, ensuring that even in the depths of winter, the communal part was never empty. But let's not romanticize this too much. While the idea of a stockpiled feast sounds idyllic, it was a constant battle against the elements and opportunistic wildlife. Imagine spending weeks drying and smoking meat, only to find it raided by a bear with a taste for jerky. It was a dance of supply and demand, where the stakes were quite literally life and death. And while we're on the topic of food, let's not sugarcoat the fact that the diet was, let's say, utilitarian. Nutritional needs came first, followed by taste. So next time you're complaining about having to eat leftovers, remember that a pot of corn mush and dried venison was often the height of culinary luxury. Now, onto the dwellings. If you think your central heating system is a marvel, wait until you hear about the architectural ingenuity of Native American winter shelters. Forget igloos and teepees. We're talking about longhouses and wigwams, structures that could withstand the wrath of winter, all while being eco-friendly before it was cool. A longhouse was essentially a communal apartment building, stretching up to 200 feet long and built to house several families. The framework was crafted from saplings, covered with bark or mats woven from reeds, creating a weatherproof cocoon. Inside, fires burned in central hearths, with smoke escaping through carefully placed holes in the roof. It was warm, it was communal, and yes, it was sometimes smokier than a jazz club. Yet, let's debunk the myth of the cozy campfire. Sure, the image of a group huddled around a fire, sharing stories, seems quaint, but the reality, not so much. Keeping a fire going was a chore, and getting smoke in your eyes wasn't just a metaphor for irritation, it was a daily nuisance. Plus, space was at a premium, so you had to hope that your neighbors were the kind of people you liked to be stuck indoors with for months on end. Talk about a social experiment. Beyond the structures, clothing was another frontier where necessity mothered some serious invention. The fashion of the day was all about functionality, with a flair for survival. Animal skins were the fabric of choice. Deer, elk, and even buffalo hides were transformed into clothing that was both insulating and waterproof. And while today's fashionistas might balk at the idea of wearing fur, back then it was literally a matter of life or death. These garments were meticulously crafted, often decorated with beads or quills, adding a touch of artistry to their practical purpose. But let's not over-glamorize the wardrobe. Sure, a fur cloak sounds opulent, but wearing one meant you were trudging through snow, not walking the red carpet. The process of making these clothes was labor-intensive, involving tanning the hides and sewing them into garments that could withstand the harshest conditions. Each stitch was a reminder of the relationship between the people and the land, a connection that was both sacred and pragmatic. And speaking of practicality, let's not forget moccasins. These soft-soled shoes weren't just a fashion statement. They were designed for warmth and agility, allowing the wearer to move silently through the snow. Try doing that in your modern winter boots. In essence, the Native American approach to winter survival was an all-hands-on-deck affair. It was community-driven, with each member contributing to the collective welfare. And while we might look back with a romanticized lens, it's crucial to remember the hardship behind the ingenuity. These were societies that understood the land in a way that most of us never will. They knew that survival wasn't just about enduring the cold, it was about thriving despite it. Sure, they had their share of hardships, but they also had resilience, humor, and a knack for turning adversity into opportunity. So, next time you're bundled up in your thermal layers and complaining about the snow, spare a thought for those who faced the same challenges with nothing but their wits, community spirit, and a hearty sense of humor. Because if they could do it, maybe we can too, just with a bit more central heating and fewer bears raiding our pantries. Stay tuned for more tales from the frostbitten past. Now that we've got our thermal layers sorted, let's stroll right into the bustling heart of tribal life, where the economics of survival were as intricate as a hand-woven basket. Forget any notions of a simple, idyllic communal existence. The truth, it was a bit like a high-stakes chess game, with each piece playing a vital role on the frozen board of life. You see, in these pre-colonial societies, everyone had a job, and no, they weren't updating their LinkedIn profiles or asking for W-2. Instead, roles were deeply ingrained, often dictated by age, gender, and skill. Take the Iroquois Confederacy, for instance. These folks didn't just rely on a random division of labor. They had a system that was as well-oiled as a politician's charm offensive. Men were typically the hunters and warriors, venturing out into the frigid wilderness in search of game or defending the tribe against those pesky neighbors who forgot to RSVP before raiding. Women, on the other hand, were the backbone of domestic life, managing the agricultural tasks and food storage with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. They were the original multitaskers, juggling corn cultivation with child rearing and community planning. But let's not get all leave it to beaver here. The reality was grittier. Community roles were about survival, not just societal norms. If a woman had a knack for hunting, you bet she was out there with the guys, tracking deer across icy landscapes. Likewise, men were often involved in crafting or assisting with agriculture when manpower was short, especially during those brutal winters when every hand mattered. Now, let's talk currency, or rather, the lack thereof. In a world without dollars, euros, or that crumpled 5 in your pocket, these tribes relied on a barter system that was both complex and efficient. Forget cash. Wampum was the real deal here. These were strings of shell beads, meticulously crafted and as valuable as a gold Rolex at a high-roller poker table. Wampum wasn't just for decoration. It was used to seal treaties, pay debts, and sometimes even to apologize for a serious faux pas, like accidentally wandering over to the next village hunting grounds. But don't let the allure of wampum beads fool you into thinking this was a primitive economy. It was anything but. Barter systems were sophisticated, with goods and services exchanged in a way that would make Wall Street brokers take notes. Corn for furs, tools for food, or even labor for protection. Everything had a value, and the art of negotiation was as essential as knowing when to throw another log on the fire. Speaking of fire, let's shed some light on the community strategy of mutual aid. If you think your neighborhood potluck is the height of communal living, think again. For these tribes, mutual aid wasn't just a feel-good activity, it was the cornerstone of survival. During harsh winters, no one hoarded resources like a Black Friday shopper. If one family had a good hunting season, their bounty would be shared, ensuring nobody went hungry. Because in these close-knit societies, your survival was tied to everyone else's, and you'd rather face a hungry bear than an angry neighbor when resources were scarce. But let's debunk the myth of idyllic communal harmony. Sure, sharing sounds noble, but it was often driven by necessity rather than altruism. Imagine the social pressure of knowing that if you didn't contribute, your name might just be the next punchline at the communal hearth. And let's not ignore the occasional disputes, because what community doesn't have a bit of drama? Arguments over hunting grounds or the division of labor could get as heated as a campfire on a cold night. But these were often resolved through council meetings, where diplomacy and conflict resolution were practiced with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. The tribal councils were another fascinating aspect. These were the decision-making bodies, the ancient equivalent of a board meeting, minus the PowerPoint slides, comprised of respected elders, chiefs, and sometimes the influential women of the tribe. These councils were where major decisions were made, be it about trade, war, or how to deal with that one tribe member who snored too loudly in the longhouse. Decisions were reached through consensus, which, let's face it, is a diplomatic feat even today. And while we're on the topic of decision-making, let's dive into the social hierarchy. Contrary to the romanticized notion of egalitarian utopias, these tribes had their own versions of social stratification. Leaders and chiefs were often chosen based on merit and wisdom, but there was also a fair amount of inheritance and lineage at play. It wasn't just a free-for-all democracy. Leadership was earned, respected, and sometimes fiercely contested. These leaders had the unenviable task of steering the tribe through the stormy seas of winter, ensuring that resources were allocated fairly and disputes settled calmly. On a lighter note, let's not forget the cultural practices that helped maintain this delicate social balance. Storytelling, music, and dance weren't just pastimes. They were vital cultural currencies that reinforced communal bonds and transmitted essential knowledge. Think of them as the original TED talks, but with more rhythm and fewer laser pointers. These narratives, often infused with humor and moral lessons, were the threads that wove the social fabric together, reminding everyone of their shared history and collective identity. So, next time you're grumbling about the chaos of modern life, just remember that these tribes faced their own challenges, with a deft mix of cooperation, negotiation, and a little bit of good old-fashioned humor. They knew that the secret to surviving harsh winters wasn't just about stockpiling resources, but about maintaining the delicate balance of a community where every member was as vital as the next. It's a lesson that echoes through time, reminding us that while the players may change, the game of survival remains as complex and captivating as ever. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the frosty tapestry of history, one thread at a time. Now that we've unraveled a cozy tapestry of tribal life, with its intricate social hierarchies and barter systems that would make even the savviest Wall Street broker do a double-take, let's crank up the thermostat on how these communities really faced winter's icy grip. Spoiler, it's not all snuggles by the communal hearth. First, let's talk about the myths of Native American winters. Hollywood might have you believe that these were times of idyllic peace, with everyone gathered around a bonfire, swapping stories and roasting marshmallows. Cue the record scratch because, while the storytelling part holds some truth, the rest is about as accurate as a broken compass. You see, winter wasn't just a season, it was the great equalizer, a time when the brutal realities of survival came knocking louder than a neighbor asking to borrow sugar. Take the romantic notion of the noble savage, a term that's about as complimentary as a backhanded compliment. This myth paints Native Americans as living in harmony with nature, unfazed by its challenges. Sure, they lived closer to nature than most of us do today, but that didn't mean they were immune to its whims. Winter was harsh, unpredictable, and downright dangerous. Starvation, hypothermia, and disease were constant threats, turning each day into a high-stakes game of survival. Let's inject some reality, shall we? In the words of the Lakota Sioux, winter is not a season, it's an occupation. It demanded relentless preparation and continuous adaptation. When the snow piled up and temperatures dropped lower than a politician's approval rating, it was all hands on deck. And by all hands, I mean every person, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, had a role to play. Consider the economic context. These tribes didn't have a stock market to hedge against a bad winter. They had to rely on their knowledge of the land and their community's collective labor. The Iroquois, for example, understood the importance of stockpiling food, creating their own version of a winter savings account. Without refrigeration, they relied on methods like drying and smoking to preserve their food. But when supplies ran low, stomachs weren't the only things growling. A bad season could lead to tribal tensions, as hunger often does a number on diplomacy. Now, let's address another myth, that of the ever-reliable natural food supply. Some folks might imagine that game animals were just frolicking around, eager to jump into a stew pot. But the reality was quite different. Animals were scarce in winter, and hunting was a risky business. Hunters had to venture out into the frozen wilderness, often for days, with no guarantee of a successful hunt. It was a gamble with nature, and sometimes the house one. The stark truth is that winter was a time of scarcity and danger, not the picturesque wonderland often imagined. But let's not just take my word for it. Listen to the voices of those who lived it. As the Ojibwa elder William Behrens once recounted, the winter was very cold, and we had little to eat. We had to endure the frost and the hunger. That's not exactly the heartwarming tale you hear in a campfire story, but it's the raw truth of survival. Speaking of survival, let's debunk the Hollywood image of the cozy, smoke-infused longhouse. Yes, these structures were engineering marvels, designed to retain heat and shelter multiple families. But cozy, not quite. Imagine living in a space with limited ventilation, where smoke from multiple fires lingered like an unwelcome guest. It was warm, sure, but it was also a smoggy affair, where the air quality rivaled that of a modern-day traffic jam. And let's not forget the close quarters. Privacy was as rare as a summer snowflake. And while we're stripping away the illusions, let's discuss clothing. Animal skins were indeed the fabric of survival, but they didn't come pre-packaged in a stylish ensemble. Preparing these garments was a labor-intensive process, involving tanning, sewing, and often a fair amount of trial and error. The result was functional, yes, but hardly the stuff of Fashion Week. Still, when the alternative was frostbite, I doubt anyone was complaining about the lack of haute couture. So why do these myths persist? Well, there's a certain allure to the idea of people living in perfect harmony with nature, untouched by its harshness. It's a comforting narrative, one that lets us gloss over the gritty details in favor of a more palatable story. But the truth is, these communities thrived not because they were immune to nature's challenges, but because they faced them head-on, with ingenuity, resilience, and a healthy dose of humor. In the end, the real story of Native American winters is one of adaptation and survival against the odds. It's a testament to human tenacity, a reminder that even in the face of nature's harshest tests, people found ways to endure. They didn't just hunker down and wait for spring. They actively engaged with their environment, using everything at their disposal to make it through to warmer days. So next time you find yourself shivering at the bus stop, remember that the challenges of winter are nothing new. They've been shaping human history for centuries, pushing us to innovate, collaborate, and sometimes find humor in the absurdity of it all. And while we might romanticize the past, it's worth acknowledging the grit and determination that truly defined those long, cold months. Because if they could laugh in the face of winter, maybe we can too, albeit with a little help from central heating and hot cocoa. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the stories of survival from the frostbitten past, one chilly tale at a time. So here we are, navigating the slippery ice of historical wisdom to see what we can learn from those who faced winters that would make a polar bear shiver. Modern society, with its plush jackets and heated car seats, might feel miles away from the snow-laden landscapes of pre-colonial North America. But hold onto your earmuffs, because there's more relevance than you might think. Let's start with the obvious, preparation. Native American tribes were the OG preppers, masters of forethought and risk management well before anyone coined the term. Their entire survival strategy was based on anticipating the worst and making sure they were ready for it. They didn't wait for the first snowflake to panic shop. They planned months in advance. Today, this translates into disaster preparedness and supply chain resilience, terms that sound all too familiar in our post-pandemic world. It's kind of ironic that despite all our technology and convenience, we had a harsh reminder recently of how quickly things can go south if we're not prepared. Then there's the concept of community. These tribes understood that survival wasn't a solo expedition. It was a team sport, and everyone had to play their part. Fast forward to today, and we see echoes of this in community-driven initiatives and social networks. Sure, we're more likely to be sharing memes than firewood, but the principle remains. When the going gets tough, the tough get together. It's a lesson that resonates even more in an age of social distancing and digital alienation. Maybe we need less doom scrolling and more community building, minus the smoke-filled longhouses, of course. Speaking of smoke, let's talk about environmental awareness. Native tribes were the original eco-warriors, living in tune with the land because they had to. They understood that depleting resources recklessly was a one-way ticket to extinction. Contrast this with today's climate crisis, and the irony is palpable. We've got all the data and technology in the world, yet we're still playing catch-up to their holistic approach to resource management. Maybe, just maybe, there's something to be said for looking back to move forward. And how about that barter system? It might seem quaint, but it was highly efficient. In today's gig economy, where side hustles are as common as coffee shops, we see a similar adaptability. People are swapping skills and services in online marketplaces, echoing the barter systems of old. It's a modern twist on an ancient strategy. If you can't buy it, trade for it. The wampum beads may have turned digital, but the principle of exchange endures. Now, let's address the elephant, or should I say the bear, in the room, the myth of the noble savage. This idea that these tribes lived in untouched harmony with nature is as misleading as a mirage. They had to fight for every inch of survival, using every bit of their environment with a pragmatism that was as gritty as it was effective. Today, we romanticize back-to-nature movements, forgetting that for these tribes, nature was less about yoga retreats and more about not becoming a popsicle. It's a reminder that while we strive for harmony with our environment, we must remain realistic about the challenges it poses. And while we're on the subject of myths, let's debunk another. The idea of endless resources. The tribes knew better than anyone that resources were finite. Their strategies for conservation and sustainable living weren't just preferences, they were necessities. Today, we grapple with overconsumption and waste, often forgetting the lessons that scarcity can teach. It's a stark reminder that sometimes less really is more. So, what's the takeaway from these frostbitten tales? It's that resilience and ingenuity are timeless tools. Whether you're braving sub-zero temperatures or navigating a crowded urban jungle, the principles remain the same. Prepare for the worst, rely on your community, respect your environment, and never underestimate the power of a good laugh in the face of adversity. In the end, the legacy of these tribes is not just in their survival, but in their adaptability. They thrived not because they tamed nature, but because they learned to dance with it, even when the music was a blizzard. And while the world has changed dramatically since those snow-covered days, the core lessons remain strikingly relevant. It's a humbling reminder that even in our technologically advanced age, some of the best survival strategies were written long before the first smartphone hit the shelves. So, next time you find yourself grumbling about the winter chill, spare a thought for those who faced it with nothing but their wits, community, and a dash of gallows humor. Because if they could laugh in the face of winter with nothing but a fire and a few good stories, maybe we can too, albeit with a bit more Wi-Fi and central heating. And who knows, perhaps there's a lesson or two in there that we can carry forward, ensuring that when the next harsh winter, literal or metaphorical, comes knocking, we're ready to face it with resilience, ingenuity, and maybe just a little bit of humor. Rome might have been all about togas and the Senate, but behind the marble columns and philosophical debates lurked a brutal reality: slavery. Picture bustling streets where roughly 1 in every 5 people was a slave. That's right. Between 10% and 20% of the population were human cogs in the great Roman machine, powering everything from agriculture to entertainment, and forget any romantic notions about loyal servants whispering wisdom into the ears of emperors. Life as a Roman slave was about as glamorous as a mud bath without the spa. Slavery in Rome wasn't just a side dish, it was the main course. The empire's economy was like a giant pyramid scheme, except the only ones climbing were the ones not doing all the work. Slaves tilled the fields, mined the earth, and even tutored children. Yes, a slave could be your kid's math teacher by day and cleaning the latrines by night. Talk about a career with variety. Now, the Romans, in their infinite wisdom, had to justify this system somehow. They might have been brutal, but they were nothing if not creative. Their go-to excuse was that slavery was a natural state, part of the divine order of things. They argued that some people were born to rule and others to serve, an idea that sounds suspiciously like a bad motivational poster. Cicero, the great orator, might have been all about justice and virtue, but he also owned slaves and saw nothing wrong with it. Hypocrisy. Thy name is Cicero. The whole operation needed a supply chain as efficient as any modern corporation. Enter the slave markets of Delos, a place where humans were sold as casually as cabbages. This Greek island was a hub of the ancient world, where you could buy a philosopher, a cook, or a gladiator, depending on your needs and budget. It's said that at its peak, the market could process up to 10,000 slaves a day. That's like an ancient Costco for human beings, minus the free samples. The atmosphere at these markets was less farmer's market and more flesh auction. Buyers prodded and poked potential purchases, checking for strength and health. The Romans even had a term for an all-too-common kind of fraud, edilitia. It referred to the practice of selling defective slaves, which was like buying a second-hand car only to find out it doesn't have an engine. And just like today's consumer laws, you could return a slave who wasn't up to scratch. How thoughtful. But what made this whole system truly bizarre was the cognitive dissonance. Romans loved to wax poetic about freedom and virtue while building their society on the backs of the enslaved. They had an interesting way of compartmentalizing their morality, seamlessly blending rhetoric about liberty with the practice of owning humans. It's like running a charity for elephants while owning an ivory shop. And don't get it twisted, being a slave in Rome wasn't a one-way ticket to misery. The social ladder was more like a slippery slope greased with olive oil. Some slaves, particularly the educated ones, could become wealthy and influential, eventually buying their freedom. The rest, well, they were stuck hoping their masters didn't wake up on the wrong side of the Roman bed. The irony of Roman slavery was that while it was a cornerstone of their economy, it came with its own contradictions and complexities. Slaves were property, yes, but they were also people who could earn and save money. Some even managed to buy their freedom, becoming freedmen who could own property and start businesses. It's like an ancient version of the American dream, only with more togas and fewer rights. So, next time someone romanticizes the glory of ancient Rome, remember that the real story is far more complicated and a lot less glamorous. The empire might have been built on the pillars of democracy and philosophy, but its foundation was human suffering. And that's a truth as enduring as the Roman ruins themselves. Now, if you think the life of a Roman slave was a leisurely stroll through the olive groves, think again. Imagine the daily grind of a field slave, who spent every waking hour under the blistering sun, cultivating the empire's insatiable appetite for wheat, olives, and grapes. These slaves were the backbone of Rome's agricultural economy, working from sunrise to sunset, with nothing more than a few scraps of bread and water to keep them going. And if you're picturing a union rep negotiating better working conditions, sorry to disappoint. These laborers had about as much leverage as a leaf in a hurricane. On the flip side, domestic slaves might have dodged the sunburn, but their lives were no less demanding. Let's just say their job descriptions were as fluid as the Tiber River. 1 minute you're preparing a lavish feast, the next you're scrubbing floors, and by nightfall might be entertaining guests with song or witty banter, assuming you've got any wit left after a 16-hour day. And before you start thinking this sounds like a Roman edition of Downton Abbey, remember that any slip-up could lead to a swift and brutal punishment. Forget time out or verbal warning. We're talking the kind of discipline that would make a horror movie look like a rom-com. Legal protections for slaves were about as common as icebergs in the Mediterranean. Roman law was clear. Slaves were property, not people, and their treatment was left largely to the whims of their masters. Sure, there were a few laws that theoretically protected slaves from excessive cruelty, but enforcement was about as reliable as a chariot with square wheels. Take the case of Lucius Pedanius Secundus, a Roman prefect whose murder resulted in the execution of 400 household slaves. Guilt by association was the name of the game, and justice, well, it was served cold and indiscriminately. But let's not sugarcoat it. The punishments meted out to slaves could be unimaginably cruel. Flogging was the go-to discipline, with slaves whipped for any infraction, real or imagined. And if a slave dared to escape, they might be branded on the forehead with the letter F for fugitivus, an ancient version of a scarlet letter that was more about shaming than fashion. The worst punishment, crucifixion, was reserved for the most rebellious, a slow, public, and excruciating death that served as both punishment and spectacle. The message was clear. Step out of line, and you pay a price higher than Rome's taxes on imported luxuries. Now, despite this grim picture, there were some bizarre perks to Roman slavery. Skilled slaves, especially those who could read and write, were in high demand and might find themselves in relatively cushy positions as scribes, accountants, or tutors. These roles offered a sliver of stability and the hope of eventual manumission, where a slave could buy their freedom and join the ranks of the freedmen. It was a carrot on a very long stick, but for some, it was a light at the end of a tunnel darker than a catacomb. And then there were the slaves who worked in the entertainment industry, gladiators and performers who could become overnight celebrities. Sure, the life expectancy of a gladiator was about as long as a snowflake in a furnace. For those who survived, fame and fortune were within reach. Successful gladiators earned hefty rewards, and some even managed to retire to a life of relative luxury. It's the ultimate rags-to-riches story, assuming you survived the rags. In the end, the life of a Roman slave was a complex tapestry of hardship, fleeting opportunities, and the ever-present risk of punishment. It was a system riddled with contradictions, where a slave could be both essential and expendable, valued and vilified. This dichotomy was the beating heart of Rome's economy, a society that thrived on the labor of the enslaved while preaching the virtues of freedom and democracy. It's a legacy as tangled and enduring as the ruins they left behind, reminding us that beneath the marble facade of Roman greatness lay the grit and grime of those who powered it. With Roman slavery being a tapestry of contradictions, it's time to unravel one of its most unexpected threads, manumission. Now, don't let the Latin fancy footwork fool you. Manumission was just a posh way of saying a slave could become free, and it happened more often than you'd think. Imagine being a cog in the Roman machine one day and waking up the next with a chance to own your own toga. Sounds like a fairy tale, right? Well, not so fast. In the topsy-turvy world of Roman society, freedom for slaves wasn't just a whimsical notion. It was a calculated maneuver. Masters, ever the pragmatists, had a few tricks up their sleeves. Granting freedom could be an economic decision, a reward for long service, or a way to secure loyalty beyond the grave, literally. Some masters would free their slaves in their wills, a final act of benevolence from beyond the Roman afterlife. It's like those, surprise, inheritances you see in soap operas, but with fewer dramatic pauses and more legal jargon. Manumission wasn't just a stroke of luck. It was also a strategic tool. Freed slaves, or liberty, could still be tethered to their former masters through obligations known as opere. Think of it as a celestial layaway plan, where you're free but still owe a few favors. This system was a win-win. The master retained a loyal ally who could navigate the free world, and the freedman got a taste of liberty, albeit with strings attached. It's like getting a new lease on life, but with a few clauses in the fine print. And here's where the story takes a rags-to-riches twist that would make any reality TV show producer salivate. Enter Trimalchio, the poster child for freedman success. This guy went from slave to one of the wealthiest men in the fictional world of Petronius Satyricon, throwing dinner parties that make the askers look like a potluck. Trimalchio is the kind of character who'd have a social media following today, self-made, lavish, and unashamedly flaunting his wealth. But before you get too misty-eyed, remember he's as much a cautionary tale as an inspiration. His lavish lifestyle was the ancient equivalent of buying a gold-plated chariot on credit, a reminder that not all that glitters is gold. Sometimes it's just guilt. The reality for most freedmen was less glitzy. Sure, they could own property, and even vote, But let's not confuse this with equality. Freedmen were often stuck in a social limbo, neither here nor there. Their children could become full citizens, but the freedmen themselves were perpetually marked by their past, a bit like wearing a "hello, I used to be a slave" badge. It's the ultimate social conundrum, where freedom was real, but its trappings were as sticky as Roman honey. Economically, these folks were a fascinating study in determination and ingenuity. Many freedmen carved out niches for themselves as merchants, craftsmen, or entrepreneurs. They were the ancient world's answer to the startup culture, hustling and bustling in a society that never fully accepted them. The Roman economy was a beast, and freedmen were among its most savvy riders, turning the skills they'd honed in servitude into profitable ventures. But let's not kid ourselves. The journey from slave to entrepreneur wasn't a stroll through a forum lined with cheering crowds. Freedmen had to navigate a labyrinth of social customs and prejudices. They were expected to maintain loyalty to their former masters, and any breach could lead to a swift downfall. It was a tightrope walk of epic proportions, with the abyss of re-enslavement always lurking below. It's a classic case of you can take the slave out of slavery, but you can't take the slavery out of the social system. Politically, the freedmen of Rome were both a demographic boon and a societal thorn. They filled roles that citizens often shunned, yet they also pushed the boundaries of what it meant to be a Roman. This duality was a source of tension, as the established elite often viewed them with suspicion and disdain. After all, who wants newcomers crashing the exclusive club's toga party? Yet, the very existence of freedmen was a testament to the fluidity and complexity of Roman society, a society that, despite its rigid hierarchies, allowed for remarkable personal transformations. As we delve deeper into the world of Roman freedmen, we see a narrative that's as tangled as a Roman road map. It's a story of survival, adaptation, and occasional triumph, where the line between freedom and bondage was as thin as a senator's patience. The tale of manumission and the lives of freedmen remind us that history isn't just about the grand conquests and towering monuments. It's also about the everyday struggles and successes of those who lived in its shadow. So, as we leave this chapter open for the next installment, keep in mind that the Roman Empire wasn't just built on the backs of slaves. It was also shaped by the hands of freedmen who seized the opportunities that manumission offered. They were the unsung architects of their destinies, navigating a world that was both fiercely challenging and ripe with potential. Their stories are a testament to the enduring human spirit, a spirit that breathes life into the dusty pages of history, reminding us that freedom, even with strings attached, is a powerful catalyst for change. Now, as we tiptoe away from the freedmen and their eternal hustle, let's dive headfirst into the world of slave revolts, where the main act is none other than Spartacus. Yes, that's Spartacus, the one with more Hollywood adaptations than you can shake a gladius at. But let's be clear, the real Spartacus wasn't just about dramatic speeches and dramatic escapes. This guy was a Thracian gladiator who decided he'd had enough of the Roman clutches and kicked off one of the most famous slave uprisings in history. In 73 BCE, Spartacus and about 70 fellow gladiators decided to swap the amphitheater for the open road, breaking free from the school of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua. Now, Capua wasn't exactly the Ritz, and training to fight to the death probably didn't come with a dental plan. So, you can see why Spartacus figured he'd try his luck elsewhere. This ragtag group of rebels quickly ballooned into an army of tens of thousands, as slaves poured in from the Roman countryside, eager to join the cause. At its peak, Spartacus's merry band of resistors numbered around 70,000, a small nation worth of people holding Roman noses to the grindstone. Let's pause here to paint a picture. Imagine trying to manage a mob of 70,000 escaped slaves, each with their own backstory, grievances, and in some cases, weapons. Logistical nightmare, you bet. Feeding them alone was a Herculean task, requiring raids on Roman storehouses and farms. And let's not forget the Romans weren't just going to stand by and watch their world collapse like an undercooked souffle. They sent in their legions, led by seasoned generals, ready to squash this uprising like a particularly annoying gnat. But Spartacus wasn't just any leader. He was a tactician who knew the value of guerrilla warfare. He led his forces through the Italian countryside, pulling off a series of victories that left Roman commanders scratching their heads and questioning their life choices. One minute, Spartacus and his crew were in Mount Vesuvius. The next, they were sweeping through the region like a tempest. His ability to outmaneuver the Roman legions was as astonishing as it was humiliating for Rome. However, let's not romanticize this too much. Spartacus's revolt, while inspiring, was plagued by internal divisions and the harsh reality of maintaining a cohesive force. The dream of returning to their homelands or creating a new society was as elusive as the Mediterranean breeze. Disagreements over strategy and goals were rampant. Some wanted to march north over the Alps to freedom, while others dreamed of plundering Rome itself, a city that was practically a fortress wrapped in the hubris of its own invincibility. Now, let's myth-bust a bit. Spartacus wasn't out to abolish slavery across the Roman Empire. His rebellion was more about personal freedom and escape than a political movement. It's tempting to see him as a proto-human rights activist, but in truth, Spartacus's primary focus was survival and liberation for himself and his followers. He wasn't exactly drafting a manifesto for universal equality while dodging Roman swords. As the revolt dragged on, Rome finally decided to bring out the big guns. Enter Marcus Licinius Crassus. This guy was richer than Croesus and had the political clout to match. Crassus, keen to make a name for himself, took command and implemented harsh discipline measures to whip the Roman legions into shape. His method, decimation. No, not the modern misuse of the word. I'm talking about the brutal Roman practice of executing 1 in every 10 soldiers from units that had shown cowardice. It was a morale booster in the same way a stick is for a mule. With Crassus at the helm, the Romans slowly began to turn the tide. Spartacus's forces were eventually cornered in southern Italy, near the Silarus River. In 71 BCE, the final showdown unfolded, and it was less David vs. Goliath, and more David vs. an entire army of Goliaths. Spartacus fought bravely, but was ultimately overwhelmed, his body presumably lost in the chaos. Because why let a good mystery go to waste? The aftermath was predictably grim. Crassus crucified around 6,000 captured slaves along the Appian Way, a gruesome reminder to anyone with rebellious inclinations. It was the Roman equivalent of a billboard that screamed, "Don't even think about it." The revolt's failure didn't end the institution of slavery, but it did send ripples through Roman society, highlighting the ever-present tension between slave and master. Spartacus became a legend, a symbol of resistance against tyranny, even though his actual aims were probably more pragmatic than ideological. His story is a testament to the complexities of rebellion and the harsh realities faced by those who dared to oppose the Roman juggernaut. And while his uprising couldn't topple the empire, it remains a powerful narrative of courage and defiance, proving that even the mightiest of empires can tremble when the oppressed rise. As for the Romans, they learned a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the power of the downtrodden, especially when they've nothing to lose. The Spartacus revolt was a wake-up call, a reminder that the empire's foundation was as shaky as a charioteer on a bumpy road. The Romans might have squashed this rebellion with their usual heavy-handedness, but the spectre of Spartacus would haunt them for years, a ghostly whisper of resistance that echoed through the annals of history. Now, with the dust settling on Spartacus's revolt, we're left to ponder the lasting impact of these uprisings. Were they mere footnotes in the grand narrative of Rome, or did they sow seeds of change that would bloom in centuries to come? That's a story for another time, as we delve deeper into the tumultuous world of Roman slavery and its indelible mark on history. Stay tuned, because the saga is far from over, and the echoes of rebellion are only just beginning to resonate through the corridors of time. And so, as the echoes of Spartacus's defiant cry fade into history, we pivot from the fiery revolt to the slow, grinding dissolution of the Roman slave system. It's like going from a blockbuster sequel to a contemplative indie film. Less action, but a compelling narrative nonetheless. Spoiler alert. The fall of Roman slavery wasn't a dramatic overnight collapse. It was more of a gradual unraveling, like an empire-sized sweater caught on a snag. The Roman economy was as reliant on slave labor as a modern coffee addict is on their morning brew. But by the 2nd century CE, the cracks were starting to show. The Roman Empire had spread itself thinner than a Roman pizza, stretching from Britain to the Middle East. The logistical nightmare of managing such vast territories made slave-based agriculture increasingly cumbersome. Transporting grain from Egypt to Rome might sound like a good idea until you factor in spoilage, storms, and pirates. Yes, pirates, the ancient world's answer to opportunistic entrepreneurs. Economic shifts started to tilt the scales away from slavery. The rise of the latifundia, those vast estates run by the wealthy elite, had initially leaned heavily on slaves. But as the cost of maintaining a large slave workforce soared, landowners began to experiment with tenant farming. Enter the colony, tenant farmers who worked the land in exchange for a share of the produce. It was like leasing a car instead of buying it outright. Less commitment, more flexibility. The colony might not have been free in the modern sense, but they weren't slaves either, and they symbolized a shift towards a more sustainable, if imperfect, agricultural model. Political factors also played a role in the slow erosion of the slave system. The Roman Empire faced relentless external pressures, barbarian invasions, anyone, that strained its resources and destabilized its economy. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE was the final nail in the coffin for the old ways. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire if you're into rebranding, continued for another 1,000 years, but with a drastically different economic structure. It was the ancient equivalent of a corporate split, with the West going bankrupt and the East pivoting to a new business model. Now, let's address the myth of the benevolent Roman master who freed his slaves out of the goodness of his toga-clad heart. While manumission was a thing, it was often driven by economic necessity or social maneuvering rather than altruism. Freed slaves, or liberty, could still contribute to their former master's wealth through taxes or continued labor, making them a sound investment. It's like upgrading a slave to a freedman version 2. 0. A savvy move in a world where loyalty was as rare as a sunburn in Britannia. As the institution of slavery began its decline, the social fabric of Rome evolved in unexpected ways. Freedmen and their descendants became increasingly influential, occupying roles in commerce and the arts. They were the ancient equivalent of a startup founder who goes from garage to penthouse, reshaping the cultural landscape in the process. Yet, despite their successes, the stigma of their origins lingered like a toga stain that just wouldn't wash out. Reflecting on the Roman experience, we find more than just an empire of marble and might. We see a society of contradictions, where the pursuit of freedom coexisted with the practice of enslavement. The Roman legacy is a grim reminder that even the most advanced civilizations can be built on foundations of inequality. It's a narrative as timeless as the Colosseum, a monument to human ambition and folly. Fast forward a couple of millennia, and we're still grappling with the echoes of Rome. Slavery might be abolished in most parts of the world, thanks 19th century, but its impact lingers like the ghost of a gladiator past. The Roman era teaches us that systems of oppression, while seemingly insurmountable, are not immutable. They can erode and evolve, often under the pressure of economic necessity and human resilience. As we wrap up this epic journey through Roman slavery, let's take a moment to appreciate the lessons it imparts. History isn't just a series of dates and dead emperors. It's a living tapestry of human experiences, triumphs, and tragedies. The story of Roman slavery is a testament to the enduring spirit of those who lived in its shadow, a reminder that the quest for freedom is as old as civilization itself. In the end, the fall of Roman slavery wasn't just a historical footnote. It was a turning point that shaped the future of Europe and beyond. It's a story that echoes through the ages, whispering truths about power, resilience, and the relentless march of progress. And while we've come a long way since the days of togas and triumphs, the lessons of Rome remain as relevant as ever, urging us to remember the past as we forge our path forward. So, as you drift off to sleep, let the tales of Rome's slaves and freedmen linger in your mind, a reminder of the complexities and contradictions that define our shared history. And never forget, behind every marble arch and ancient ruin lies a story of human endeavor waiting to be told. In the bustling streets of Georgian London, where wigs were big and hygiene was not, a curious bottle was making its way into every nook and cranny of society. This wasn't some fancy French perfume or a newfangled tonic for those delightful 18th century maladies. No, it was laudanum, the opium-based concoction that promised to cure everything from headaches to heartaches. If you were alive in the 1700 and didn't have a bottle tucked away somewhere, were you even living, laudanum, you see, was the medical marvel of its time. It was like the Swiss Army knife of remedies, allegedly curing anything that ailed you. The brainchild of Paracelsus, a Swiss physician who must have had quite the flair for alchemy, laudanum started as an opium tincture mixed with a bit of saffron, some cinnamon, and a splash of wine. First concocted in the 16th century, it took a few centuries to really catch on, but once it hit London, it was like the Beatles of medicine. Everybody wanted a piece. This miracle potion was dirt cheap too. For a mere shilling, you could get a bottle that might just fix your sleepless nights or ease your chronic gout. And it wasn't just the aristocrats indulging in this liquid gold. Laudanum was available to everybody from the lowliest chimney sweep to the most elegant duchess. Apothecaries were practically giving the stuff away, selling it for as little as a penny a dose. It was like the original get-well-soon card, only far more effective at dulling the pain of 18th century life. Doctors of the era were more than happy to endorse this wonder drug, though endorse might be a strong word for what was often a vague shrug and a muttered, "Why not give it a go?" The medical community was still in its experimental phase, where the line between treatment and catastrophe was more of a guideline than a rule. In their defense, this was a time when bleeding was considered a sensible treatment for almost everything. In that context, a bit of opium probably seemed downright logical. But let's not get too misty-eyed about this supposed cure-all. Laudanum's popularity wasn't just about its medicinal properties. It was a cultural phenomenon, a social staple, and a way to cope with the gritty reality of London life, which was anything but picturesque. The city was teeming with people, and the air was thick with smoke, and the aroma of, well, everything you'd expect from a pre-sewerage-era metropolis. Laudanum was a means of escape, a way to blur the harsh edges of reality, and it didn't discriminate. It was the great equalizer, soothing the nerves of the rich and poor alike. With such widespread use, one might wonder if anyone ever questioned the long-term implications of regular laudanum consumption. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Laudanum was like that one friend who always promises to help you move, but never shows up on moving day. It was reliable in the short term, sure, but the long-term payoff was less than ideal. Yet, for many, the immediate relief was worth the gamble. And here's the kicker. The addictive nature of opium wasn't exactly a state secret. People knew about it, much like we know that drinking a gallon of coffee a day might not be the best idea. But in a time when existential dread could be as common as the common cold, laudanum was the crutch that stayed faithful. Socially, laudanum became something of a paradox. It was both revered and feared, a symbol of both sophistication and dependency. For some, it was the secret to their creative genius. For others, it was the shackles that bound them. Esteemed poets like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Thomas de Quincey famously wrestled with its grip, their literary prowess seemingly inseparable from their laudanum-laden musings. So, why did laudanum become such a staple in Georgian London? The answer lies in a cocktail of circumstances. A burgeoning metropolis with all the stress that accompanies rapid urban growth, medical practitioners grasping for effective treatments, and a populace eager for relief. In an era before the NHS, and with a healthcare system that could generously be described as rudimentary, laudanum was the closest thing to a universal remedy the people had. Of course, the story of laudanum isn't all about the allure and the relief. That's the romantic version. It's about to take a darker turn, but before we delve into the grim reality, let's appreciate the absurdity of it all. Here was a drug that was essentially unregulated, widely available, and openly consumed by everyone and their mothers. It was like selling chocolate bars with a side of may cause extreme dependency and societal collapse. But who had time to read the fine print when there were pressing matters like smallpox and the occasional Napoleon to worry about? The stage was set, the players were in place, and laudanum was about to become more than just a household staple. It was going to be a cautionary tale, a lesson in the perils of unbridled consumption. But for now, as we stand at the precipice of its darker days, laudanum was still the darling of the medical world and the unassuming guest at every London dinner table. Stay tuned, because things are about to get interesting. Laudanum's popularity, while certainly impressive, was not without its looming shadows. For every poet who waxed lyrical under its influence, there was a sobering tale of dependency and despair. Take Samuel Taylor Coleridge, for instance. A literary giant, sure, but also a man shackled by his laudanum habit. Coleridge wasn't just sipping the occasional drop. He was chugging the stuff like it was the fountain of poetic youth. His addiction was so profound that he once described himself as a slave to the drop. And yet, it was this very dependency that seemed to unlock the door to his creative genius, blurring the lines between inspiration and addiction. But let's not put on rose-tinted glasses and romanticize the tortured artist stereotype too much. Laudanum wasn't just fueling creativity, it was wreaking havoc on lives. The reality was far less glamorous. Coleridge may have penned Kubla Khan in a laudanum-induced haze, but he also spent years battling the physical and mental chains of addiction, isolated and tormented by his own mind. And then there was Thomas de Quincey, another literary figure who found himself ensnared by laudanum's siren call. His Confessions of an English Opium Eater was both a cautionary tale and a bizarre advertisement for the drug. De Quincey painted a vivid picture of his opium dreams, full of grandeur and terror, and inadvertently sparked a wave of curiosity and experimentation among his readers. It was like telling a child not to touch the stove, then leaving the kitchen door wide open. But the grip of laudanum wasn't limited to the literary elite. It was a democratizing force, spreading its tendrils into every corner of society. Let's shift gears from the ivory towers of literature to the gritty streets of Georgian London. Here, the story of laudanum takes on a more Everyman quality. Picture a city teeming with life, noise, and frankly, not that much personal space. In this urban jungle, laudanum was the escape valve for everyday Londoners, a way to numb the relentless grind of life in a rapidly industrializing world. Consider the case of Mary Robinson, known as Perdita from her stage days. A celebrated actress and later a writer, Mary turned to laudanum to manage the chronic pain from a disabling illness. Her story underscores the harsh reality that for many, laudanum was less about chasing artistic muses and more about surviving another day. Mary's dependence was both a physical necessity and a cruel burden, showing that laudanum was as much a trap as it was a relief. And let's not ignore the economic engine driving this widespread use. Apothecaries and chemists were making a killing off laudanum sales. With virtually no regulations in place, selling laudanum was as easy as setting up shop and slapping a label on a bottle. The pharmaceutical industry of the day was less concerned with public health than with profit margins. In an era where snake oil salesmen thrived, laudanum was the king of cash cows. It was opium, after all, and demand was as high as the customers often were. Ironically, the very thing that made laudanum so accessible, its affordability, was also what made it so dangerous. When you can buy a shot of oblivion for a penny, who wouldn't be tempted to indulge, especially in a city where the harsh realities of industrial life made escapism more appealing than ever? But as laudanum's popularity soared, so did the whispers of concern. The emerging public health discourse began to question the wisdom of such widespread availability. Yet the economic incentives were hard to ignore. The pharmaceutical industry had little reason to curb its enthusiasm for laudanum. After all, it wasn't just a medicine. It was a consumer product, sold with all the flair and promise of the latest gadget at a tech expo. This wasn't just about treating ailments. It was about creating a market, nurturing dependence, and ensuring a steady stream of returning customers. The same economic forces that propelled laudanum to its height were also the ones that kept it there, despite the growing evidence of its destructive potential. As we peel back the layers of this tale, it's clear that laudanum's story is a tangled web of human desires, economic motivations, and social pressures. It's a story where the lines between victim and willing participant blur, where creativity and destruction dance a complicated waltz. So, as we stand in this moment of history, surrounded by the echoes of those who lived and suffered in laudanum's shadow, we must ask ourselves, was it worth it? For those who found solace or inspiration, perhaps, but for the many who paid the price of dependency, the answer is far less certain. As we delve deeper into the labyrinth of laudanum's impact, remember that we're only scratching the surface of a much larger narrative. The stage is set for more twists and turns as the story of Laudanum continues to unfold, revealing the intricate tapestry of a world grappling with the consequences of its own creations. So, keep your wits about you, because things are only going to get more intriguing from here. And so the tale of Laudanum marches on, weaving through Georgian London like a persistent, bittersweet melody. As the curtain rises on its darker chapters, we're left to ponder the shadowy consequences of a society enthralled by this beguiling tincture. This isn't just the story of a drug, but a reflection of human folly wrapped in the comforting cloak of oblivion. It's time to lift the veil on the grim aftermath of Laudanum's rampant use, where the vibrant streets of London were often tinged with tragedy. While Laudanum offered a temporary escape from life's trials, its dark side was never far from the surface. For many, the initial relief it provided quickly spiraled into a relentless cycle of dependency. Those euphoric moments of respite gave way to the crushing reality of addiction, leaving individuals trapped in a maze with no clear exit. The physical toll was severe. Regular users experienced everything from digestive issues and respiratory problems to debilitating withdrawal symptoms. Imagine feeling as though your insides were twisted in knots, all while being crushed by an invisible weight, a feeling that became all too familiar to the Laudanum addict. But personal suffering was only part of the story. Broader social consequences were equally devastating. Families disintegrated under the weight of addiction, with relationships stretched to the breaking point by deceit and financial strain. When a person's primary focus becomes securing their next dose, little else matters. And in the cramped quarters of Georgian London, where privacy was a luxury few could afford, the domestic fallout was often on full public display. The whispers in the streets spoke of homes torn apart, of children left to fend for themselves, while parents chased the dragon. Public health concerns began to bubble to the surface, like a pot of soup left too long on the fire. The sheer scale of Laudanum consumption was alarming, and it wasn't long before the authorities had no choice but to take notice. But in true bureaucratic fashion, the response was less a decisive strike and more a series of haphazard jabs. Enter the first government attempts to regulate the drug trade, a Herculean task akin to stopping a tidal wave with a teaspoon. In 1868, the Pharmacy Act tried to put a lid on the rampant sale of opium-based concoctions. It mandated that only qualified pharmacists could sell Laudanum, a noble effort that unfortunately arrived a few decades too late to stem the tide. The act was more a suggestion than a commandment, with loopholes wide enough to drive a carriage through. In practice, it did little to curb the widespread availability of Laudanum. Chemists continued to sell it under the counter, often with a wink and a nod. The myth of Laudanum's innocence persisted, a convenient half-truth that allowed society to turn a blind eye to the wreckage it left in its wake. After all, how could something so ubiquitous, so entrenched in daily life, be truly perilous? It was easier to romanticize the notion of the tortured artist, the visionary fueled by opium's dark muse, than to confront the stark reality of widespread addiction. And therein lay the allure of the myth. In a world teetering on the brink of the Industrial Revolution, where change was the only constant, Laudanum offered a seductive promise of stability. It whispered sweet nothings in the ear of a society desperate for relief, even as it tightened its grip around the throats of its unsuspecting victims. This was the paradox of Laudanum, a drug that purported to heal while sowing the seeds of destruction. Yet, amidst the chaos, there were those who saw through the veneer of innocence. Critics of the time began to voice their concerns, calling for stricter measures and greater awareness of the drug's dangers. These early advocates for reform were the unsung heroes in a battle against complacency, their voices drowned out by the clamor of a society unwilling to relinquish its crutch. They understood that education was key, that only by shining a light on the true nature of Laudanum could its grip be loosened. The economic motives behind Laudanum's proliferation cannot be ignored. As the demand for opium surged, so too did the profits of those who supplied it. The East India Company, with its fingers in many pies, was one such beneficiary. It controlled the opium trade with an iron fist, reaping the rewards of a booming market. For them, Laudanum was more than a commodity. It was a golden goose, laying eggs of pure profit. And while the moral implications of such a trade were murky at best, The financial incentives were clear as day. But for every coin that lined a merchant's pocket, there was a cost borne by society. The public health crisis that emerged was a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked consumption. Yet, despite the warning signs, the wheels of commerce continued to turn, driven by the insatiable demand for relief from the harsh realities of life. As the story of Laudanum unfolds, it's clear that this isn't just a tale of addiction. It's a testament to the complexities of human nature. The desire for escape, the struggle for control, the economic forces at play, all these elements intertwine to create a narrative that is as compelling as it is cautionary. And as we delve deeper into the labyrinthine world of Laudanum, we must remember that history is not just a collection of dates and facts, but a living tapestry of experiences and lessons. The saga of Laudanum is one of paradoxes and perplexities, a reflection of the human experience in all its flawed glory. It's a reminder of the perils of unchecked indulgence, of the fine line between relief and ruin. And while the story doesn't end here, as we stand on the brink of its next chapter, we are left to ponder the enduring legacy of a drug that promised so much yet delivered so little. As we prepare to explore the next twists and turns of this narrative, let us keep in mind the lessons of the past. For in understanding the history of Laudanum, we gain insights into our own struggles and triumphs, our own capacity for both creation and destruction. So, stay tuned as we navigate the murky waters of Laudanum's legacy, ever mindful of the shadows that linger on the periphery of progress. As we navigate the murky waters of Laudanum's legacy, it's clear that the story of this beguiling tincture is not just about personal addiction, but a reflection of the broader societal upheavals of Georgian London. The city was a living organism, pulsating with change as industrialization and urbanization took center stage. Picture a bustling metropolis transforming before your eyes, where the clatter of machinery was the soundtrack of progress, and the skyline was a patchwork of soot-stained factories. In this rapidly evolving landscape, the working class bore the brunt of both industrial growth and Laudanum's dark embrace. The Industrial Revolution turned the wheels of the economy, but it also ground down the people who kept those wheels turning. Long hours in grim factories, inhaling the noxious fumes of progress, left workers physically and mentally depleted. For them, Laudanum wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline, an affordable escape from the relentless grind. And at just a penny a dose, it was cheaper than a pint of porter, making it the go-to remedy for the beleaguered masses. But the irony was as thick as the London fog. While Laudanum offered a temporary reprieve, it also tightened the chains of dependency. The very people who kept the city humming were ensnared in a vicious cycle of addiction, trapped by the very remedy they relied on. It was a paradox of Dickensian proportions. The medicine that dulled their pain was also the poison that kept them shackled. The societal reaction to this epidemic was a fascinating tapestry of moral outrage and sympathetic understanding. On one hand, you had the sanctimonious finger-waggers, eager to cast judgment from on high. These were the folks who saw addiction as a moral failing, a sign of weak character rather than a symptom of societal neglect. They were quick to condemn the addicts, conveniently ignoring the fact that the system was rigged against them from the start. Because let's face it, it's much easier to blame the victim than to confront the uncomfortable truth of systemic inequality. On the other hand, there were those who viewed the Laudanum crisis through a lens of compassion, recognizing it as a public health issue rather than a personal failing. These early advocates for reform understood that addiction was not a choice, but a consequence of circumstance. They argued for better working conditions, healthcare, and social support systems, knowing that these were the true antidotes to the Laudanum epidemic. They were the unsung heroes, fighting for change in a world that was stubbornly resistant to it. And let's not forget the role of art and literature in shaping public perception. Writers and artists of the time grappled with the dual nature of Laudanum, capturing both its allure and its destructiveness. In their works, they immortalized the tortured genius of the Laudanum-fueled visionary, while also exposing the grim reality of addiction's toll. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater was a prime example, offering a vivid portrayal of the highs and lows of opium use. It was a narrative as enthralling as it was cautionary, a window into the mind of an addict that both fascinated and horrified its readers. The visual arts, too, reflected this dichotomy. Paintings of the era often depicted the opium den as a place of both mystery and misery, a realm where dreams and nightmares converged. These works served as both a warning and a testament to Laudanum's grip on society, capturing the complex interplay between addiction and creativity. Yet, amidst the moral debates and artistic portrayals, the economic engine driving Laudanum's proliferation hummed along unabated. The trade in opium was a lucrative business, with profits flowing freely from the East India Company's coffers. This wasn't just about medicine. It was about money, power, and control. The very forces that fueled the Industrial Revolution also stoked the fires of the Laudanum epidemic, creating a perfect storm of supply and demand. As the Laudanum story unfolds, it's clear that this isn't just a tale of addiction. It's a reflection of the broader societal changes of the time. It's a reminder of how the forces of industrialization and urbanization shape the lives of ordinary people, for better and for worse. And as we continue to explore this narrative, we must keep in mind the lessons it offers, both for the past and the present. Because in the end, the story of Laudanum is also a story about us, our desires, our struggles, and our capacity for both creation and destruction. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the labyrinthine world of Laudanum, ever mindful of the shadows that linger on the periphery of progress. Now, as we dive into the final chapter of this Laudanum-laden saga, let's talk about the decline of this once-beloved tincture. Spoiler alert, it wasn't a dramatic fall from grace, but more of a gradual retreat into the shadows. Like a celebrity whose star power wanes, Laudanum didn't disappear overnight. Instead, it slowly slipped from the public's favor, nudged along by a few key developments and a societal shift in how we viewed medicine and addiction. First off, the medical community finally decided to get its act together. By the late 19th century, advances in medical science were casting a very bright light on the murky waters of the drug's effects. Doctors were starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, prescribing a highly addictive substance for everything from a toothache to tuberculosis wasn't the best idea. You could say this was the original oops, my bad moment in the pharmaceutical world. The discovery of more effective and less addictive pain relief options, like aspirin in 1899, began to replace Laudanum's spot on the medicinal throne. Aspirin was like the new kid in town, and boy, did it make a splash. But it wasn't just the darks who were wising up. The law finally decided to step in and lay down some ground rules. The 1868 Pharmacy Act was just a warm-up. The real game-changer was the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920, which put a serious damper on the Laudanum party. No longer could you waltz into your local apothecary and walk out with a bottle of opium-laced oblivion. It was like prohibition, but for opium, and the authorities were finally getting serious about regulating this stuff. Public perception played a significant role, too. As stories of addiction and ruin became more widespread, the romantic sheen of Laudanum began to tarnish. The narrative shifted from the dreamy haze of artistic inspiration to the harsh reality of dependency and its devastating effects. Society started to see addiction less as a moral failing and more as a public health crisis, a shift that's still pretty relevant today. It's a curious thing when you think about it, how a substance can go from being a miracle cure to a pariah in the public eye. And let's not forget economics. The opium trade, once a lucrative enterprise, was falling out of favor globally. International pressure and changing trade dynamics meant that the economic incentives for peddling Laudanum were drying up. It was no longer the cash cow it once had been, and without the financial backing, its prevalence naturally declined. So what's the takeaway here? Well, Laudanum's story is a cautionary tale that echoes in modern times. It's a stark reminder of how easily society can fall for the allure of a quick fix without fully considering the consequences. Today, we face similar challenges with substances like opioids, a modern-day reflection of our past missteps. Despite being centuries apart, the core issues remain eerily familiar: the clash between economic interests, regulatory frameworks, and public health. In the end, Laudanum left us with a legacy that's both sobering and enlightening. It forced society to grapple with the complexities of addiction and to rethink our approach to drug policy. The lessons learned from the Laudanum era have informed how we handle substance abuse today highlighting the importance of regulation, education, and compassion. Yet, as we compare historical attitudes to contemporary issues with substance abuse, there's a wry irony at play. Just as in the Georgian period, society still struggles to balance the benefits of medical advancements with the potential for abuse. We still romanticize the tortured genius, the idea that creativity is somehow fueled by substances that ultimately destroy. But history serves as a reminder that real progress comes from understanding, not from glorifying the struggle. So, as we draw the curtain on the story of Laudanum, let's take a moment to reflect on the lessons it offers. It's a tale of human ingenuity and folly, of the persistent quest for relief, and the unintended consequences that follow. In the words of George Santayana, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. With Laudanum as our guide, perhaps we can navigate today's challenges with a bit more wisdom and foresight. And there you have it, the rise and fall of Laudanum in all its bittersweet glory. From miracle cure to cautionary tale, its journey through history is a testament to our capacity for both brilliance and blunder. So next time you pop an aspirin, take a moment to appreciate the lessons learned from our Laudanum-loving ancestors. After all, understanding the past is the first step toward a brighter, more informed future. In the grand tapestry of history, the Roman Senate is often spun as the ultimate authority, a body of wise, noble elders guiding Rome from a quaint village to the empire that would rule most of the known world. But hold your chariots, folks. Before you start scribbling fan mail to Julius Caesar and his pals, let's rewind to the Senate's gritty origins around 753 BC. Back then, the Senate was less an assembly of demigods and more like the crew of your local coffee shop, where everyone's got an opinion, but no one's really in charge. The Senate sprouted up in the early days of Rome when kings were the name of the game. These kings probably saw the Senate as a necessary evil, a group of wrinkly advisors to bounce ideas off, not unlike a modern CEO's board of directors. It was a time when Rome was a baby city-state, and the Senate was more advisory than authoritative. This was no polished institution. It was a political sandbox where the big kids played dirty. To set the scene, picture a Rome that's more village than metropolis, nestled by the Tiber River with some 1,000 inhabitants. Not exactly the sprawling empire of later years. Right. The Senate back then was made up of about 100 members, give or take a few ambitious climbers or fallers, each representing the patrician families. Think of them as your old money elites. These guys were the early adopters of the I know what's best for everyone vibe. Now, the romanticized image of the Senate as a bastion of democracy. Yeah, not exactly accurate. In reality, it was more like a political fight club. The patricians wielded power like a toddler with a crayon, messily and often with disastrous results. The Senate's influence ebbed and flowed with the whims of the ruling king. Take Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome, who treated the Senate more like a suggestion box that he could conveniently ignore. It turns out, power-hungry monarchs and advisory bodies don't mix well. Who knew? The early Senate wasn't just about patrician families playing politics. It was also a lesson in survival of the shrewdest. Senators had to navigate a labyrinth of backdoor deals, alliances, and betrayals. You know, the kind of stuff that would make a soap opera writer blush. It wasn't so much about the common good as it was about personal gain and family prestige. Of course, these dynamics also turned the Senate into a hotbed of corruption long before it became fashionable. Despite the chaos, the Senate did manage to carve out a unique role for itself. It became the unofficial keeper of tradition and law, the ones who'd remind the kings that they couldn't just rewrite the rules every time they threw a tantrum. They were the referees in a game where the rules changed as often as the weather. But let's not get too misty-eyed. The early days of the Senate were less about governance and more about survival. Survival of the Roman state, sure, but mostly survival of the senators' own necks. These were not altruistic public servants working for the greater good. These were power players and family dynasties maneuvering through a time of constant change and uncertainty. So, next time you hear about the noble Roman Senate, remember that its roots are tangled in the gritty realities of ancient politics. This was an institution built not on the lofty ideals of democracy and justice, but on a foundation of political maneuvering and power struggles. It's a reminder that history is often more complex and more interesting than the myths we wrap around it. And that's just the beginning. As the centuries rolled on, this ragtag advisory council would evolve into one of the most influential political bodies in history, but not without leaving a trail of intrigue, betrayal, and a few decapitated heads along the way. Stay tuned, because the plot is just about to thicken. And just like that, monarchy of Rome was as dead as yesterday's toga styles. It's 509 BC, and Rome is wiping the slate clean, or so the story goes. The last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, was ousted, not because he was a tyrant, though he certainly was, but because he was a tyrant without finesse. The Senate and Rome's elite had had enough. They decided it was time for a change, a republic where the power wouldn't rest with one man, but in the hands of Rome's best and brightest. And by best and brightest, I mean the patricians, the city's top-tier families who had more in common with a modern-day corporate boardroom than a democratic assembly. The romanticized narrative of this transition often paints it as a noble quest for democracy. But let's not kid ourselves. This was less about the voice of the people and more about a calculated power grab by the elite, a hostile takeover with a PR twist. The Senate, which had been more of a royal rubber stamp in the days of kings, would now take on a starring role. Think of it as a political makeover show, but instead of new curtains and a sofa, you get a shiny new system of governance. Enter the Roman Republic, where the Senate was supposed to be the voice of reason. But let's peel back that shiny veneer. The Senate was essentially a club for the patricians, those old money families who saw themselves as the rightful rulers of Rome. They were the kind of folks who put their names on buildings if they could. But for now, they'd settle for a seat at the table where the real decisions were made. The Senate swelled to about 300 members, a number that might seem unwieldy, but when you're divvying up the spoils of power, you want as many insiders as possible. But before we get lost in the corridors of power, let's talk about the patricians and plebeians, the two classes that made up early Roman society. The patricians were the Senate's bread and butter, the ones who wore the metaphorical pants in the political family. They claimed descent from Rome's original founders, which was basically ancient Rome's version of my ancestor came over on the Mayflower. Meanwhile, the plebeians were everyone else. They were the farmers, the craftsmen, the soldiers, the heart of Rome's workforce and military, might but largely excluded from the political process. In modern terms, they were the essential workers without a voice in the boardroom. This wasn't a recipe for social harmony. The plebeians soon realized that if they wanted a say in how things were run, they'd need to push back. And push back they did in what became known as the conflict of the orders, a series of social struggles that lasted over 2 centuries. The plebeians were like the squeaky wheel that gets the grease, only they were demanding more than just grease. They wanted real, tangible power. Eventually, the plebeians did make some headway. They gained their own representatives, called tribunes, who had the power to veto decisions made by the Senate. They also fought for laws to be written down in public for everyone to see, leading to the creation of the 12 Tables around 450 BC. These were Rome's first set of laws, and having them displayed meant that the patricians couldn't just change the rules on a whim. It was a step toward a more fair and transparent legal system, although fair is relative when you're dealing with ancient Rome. But let's not get too carried away with notions of equality. The Senate was still a patrician playground. The tribunes could shout, veto, all they wanted, but the real power dynamics were harder to shift. The patricians were the gatekeepers of Rome's political and religious life, and they were experts at keeping the plebeians at arm's length while making it look like progress was being made. So here we are, in the early days of the Republic, with the Senate claiming center stage. But remember, this wasn't a democracy in the way we understand it today. This was political theater, where the Senate was more about protecting the interests of the elite than serving the common good. Yet, despite, or perhaps because of, these Machiavellian maneuverings, Rome's political system was surprisingly stable, and the Republic would last for nearly 500 years. The Senate was not just about political power, though. It was also about economic clout. Rome was expanding, and with expansion came wealth. The control of that wealth was crucial, and the Senate knew it. They were the ones who decided on matters of war and peace, and let's be honest, War was often just a way to boost Rome's coffers. Conquering new territories meant more resources, more slaves, and more money, things that were very dear to the Senate's heart, if not to their actual wallets. This wasn't all cloak and dagger stuff, though. The Senate also had its fair share of bureaucratic responsibilities. They oversaw public works, religious rituals, and the allocation of funds, which was no small task in a growing city. Here's where the Senate's reputation as the keepers of tradition came into play. They were the ones who ensured that Rome didn't lose its way amid its rapid expansion. At least that was the theory. Yet, despite its flaws, the Senate was also where some of Rome's greatest minds shone. These were the men who laid the groundwork for what would become Western political thought. Figures like Cicero, who would come later, cut their teeth in this environment, debating philosophy, law, and the nature of power. The Senate was a crucible for ideas, even if those ideas were often more self-serving than altruistic. As the Republic matured, the Senate would face new challenges and opportunities, each one shaping its role in ways that would echo through history. The stage was set for a series of events that would test the limits of this system, pushing Rome toward a future that was as unpredictable as it was inevitable. But for now, the Senate was content to bask in its newfound authority, playing the long game in a world that was changing faster than a Roman could say, carpe diem. And so, the story of the Senate continues, a blend of ambition, intrigue, and the eternal struggle for power. But don't get too comfortable. The plot is about to thicken, with more twists than a Roman road. Stay tuned. So, with the Senate basking in its newfound authority and Rome expanding faster than a Caesar's ego, let's dive deeper into the Roman Republic's golden era. Picture the Senate at its peak, a bustling hub of political intrigue where power was traded like stocks in a Wall Street fever dream. But before you get swept away by visions of eloquent debates and noble statesmen, let's inject a dose of reality into this toga party. First up, let's talk about Cicero, the Senate's poster child for eloquence and verbosity. Marcus Tullius Cicero was like the Shakespeare of Roman politics, except he was real, and his soliloquies could actually influence policy. Born in 106 BC, Cicero was a self-made man, a novus homo, which in Roman terms meant he was the first in his family to enter the Senate. Imagine walking into a club where everyone else is a legacy member, and you've just got your shiny new membership card. That's Cicero. This guy was a master orator, a lawyer by trade, and his speeches could flip a room faster than you can say, "Et tu, brute." His most famous gig was taking down Catiline, a rogue senator who was plotting to overthrow the Republic. Cicero's speeches against Catiline were so persuasive that they are still studied today. But let's not get too misty-eyed. For all his oratorical flair, Cicero was also a political animal. He loved the sound of his own voice as much as the next senator, and wasn't above a little backstabbing, metaphorically speaking, of course. Now, while Cicero was busy crafting his legacy, let's not forget about Cato the Younger, who took political integrity to a whole new level. Born in 95 BC, Cato was a staunch defender of the Republic's traditional values. He was so rigid, he made the Leaning Tower of Pisa look like a straight arrow. Cato's unyielding nature made him a thorn in the side of anyone who dared to corrupt the Senate's ideals. Think of him as the Senate's grumpy old watchdog, barking at anyone who stepped out of line. But here's the kicker. Both Cicero and Cato operated in a Senate rife with corruption and factionalism. The place was a political shark tank where alliances were as fickle as Roman weather. Senators engaged in endless power games, forming factions that were more about personal power than public service. It was like a reality TV show, but with more gladiators and fewer rose ceremonies. Speaking of gladiatorial combat, let's debunk the romanticized image of senatorial oratory. Sure, the speeches were grand, and the rhetoric was flowing, but the real action happened behind closed doors. Backdoor deals, whispered agreements, and financial incentives were the true currency of power. Senators traded favors like kids swapping baseball cards, and the oratory was often just theater for the masses. Take, for instance, the economic context that shaped these political machinations. Rome's expansion meant wealth was pouring in, but it also meant more mouths to feed and more soldiers to pay. The Senate controlled the purse strings, deciding when and where Rome went to war. But let's not be naive. These decisions were often driven by personal gain. War wasn't just a matter of national security. It was a lucrative business. Conquering new territories meant more spoils, more slaves, and more resources to line the pockets of Rome's elite. The political landscape was further complicated by the growing divide between the Optimates and the Populares, the two main political factions. The Optimates, like Caro, were the conservative aristocrats who wanted to maintain the status quo. The Populares, on the other hand, were more progressive, appealing to the common people for support. It was a classic struggle between tradition and reform, and the Senate was the battleground where these ideological skirmishes played out. Yet, amid the power struggles and political posturing, the Senate managed to maintain its grip on Rome. This wasn't just due to its ability to adapt and evolve. It was also because the Senate understood the importance of public perception. They were the masters of spin, crafting narratives that painted the Senate as the guardian of Rome's values, even when reality was far messier. The Senate's influence extended beyond politics into the very fabric of Roman society. They controlled religious rituals, public festivals, and even the calendar. Imagine having the power to decide when the year began or which days were holidays. It was like being the DJ at the biggest party in town, and the Senate played that role with aplomb. As Rome marched toward the 1st century BC, the Senate was at the height of its power, but the seeds of its eventual decline were already being sown. The Republic was a delicate balancing act, and the increasing concentration of power in the hands of a few would soon tip the scales. The rise of powerful generals, like Julius Caesar, would challenge the Senate's authority and set the stage for a seismic shift in Roman politics. But for now, the Senate remains the beating heart of the Republic, navigating a world of ambition, intrigue, and the eternal struggle for control. As we continue our journey through history, remember that the tales of the Senate are not just stories of past glories or failures, but lessons in human nature and the timeless dance of power. So hold onto your laurel wreaths, because this saga is far from over, and the drama is just getting started. As the Senate basked in its self-styled role as the heartbeat of the Republic, it probably felt as invincible as a gladiator on a winning streak. But beneath the toga-clad bravado, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. And no, this isn't just a dramatic metaphor. Real political turbulence was brewing, and it came with the fierce determination of Julius Caesar himself. Let's fast forward to 49 BC. Caesar, a man with more ambition than a reality TV star, made a bold move that would forever alter Rome's political landscape. He crossed the Rubicon. Now, crossing a river may not sound like a big deal, unless you're a Roman general who's just violated a direct order from the Senate that forbade him from bringing his army into Italy. It was a point of no return, a declaration of civil war, and the Senate, bless their procedural hearts, was caught with its toga in a twist. Julius Caesar wasn't just playing chess while the Senate was playing checkers. He'd flipped the board entirely. The Senate, once a bastion of power, found itself scrambling for relevance. For years, they'd managed to maintain authority by deftly playing factions against each other. But Caesar was a new kind of player, one who didn't care for the Senate's old game. He had his own rules, his own pieces, and a vision for Rome that didn't include a bunch of squabbling aristocrats dictating his every move. Here's a juicy tidbit. Rome's elite loved a good power struggle, but they were woefully underprepared for someone like Caesar, who combined military genius with a knack for public relations. His Commentarii de Bello Gallico, essentially a series of war dispatches, turned his military campaigns into bestseller material, bolstering his image as a hero of the people. The Senate, meanwhile, was left looking like yesterday's news, a bunch of wrinkly old men clinging to power like it was the last goblet of wine at a banquet. With Caesar's infamous crossing, the Republic was thrust into civil chaos. The Senate, unable to corral the political situation, saw its influence wane as generals with personal armies became the real power brokers. The once mighty Senate had become the political equivalent of a paper tiger, fierce-looking but flimsy when push came to shove. By 44 BC, Caesar's consolidation of power reached its zenith when he was declared dictator perpetuo, or dictator for life. The Senate, now more ceremonial than powerful, was reduced to rubber-stamping Caesar's edicts. It's tempting to romanticize this period as a noble Senate reluctantly yielding to Caesar's charisma, but the reality was more sordid. Political maneuvering and coercion were the order of the day, with many senators either bribed or bullied into submission. And then, of course, came the Ides of March. Caesar's assassination in 44 BC is often portrayed as the Senate's last stand, a dramatic act of defiance to restore the Republic. But let's be real, it was less about high-minded principles and more about a desperate attempt by a faction of senators to reclaim relevance. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Instead of reinvigorating the Senate, it plunged Rome into further chaos, paving the way for the rise of the empire. Enter Augustus, a man who knew how to play the long game. By 27 BC, he'd wrapped up the civil wars and laid the groundwork for the Roman Empire, cleverly rebranding the Senate's role in the process. Augustus, formerly known as Octavian, was Caesar's adopted heir, and unlike his predecessor, he understood the value of appearances. He didn't dissolve the Senate. Instead, he transformed it into a prestigious club of sorts, where senators could enjoy the perks of status without the pesky burden of real power. Augustus's genius lay in his ability to placate the Senate while consolidating control. He peppered his own supporters among the senators, ensuring loyalty while maintaining the illusion of a functioning republic. The Senate, now more of a ceremonial body, was content to bask in its historical prestige even as its political teeth were being methodically extracted. Augustus's title of princeps, or first citizen, was a masterstroke of PR, positioning him as Rome's leading figure without the ominous overtones of dictatorship. Economically, Rome was booming, and Augustus knew that a content Senate was less likely to stir trouble. By controlling the flow of wealth and ensuring that senators had a stake in the empire's prosperity, he effectively neutralized potential opposition. Augustus was the puppet master, and the Senate, willingly or not, danced to his tune. So, let's debunk the myth of the Senate willingly handing over the keys to the empire. It was less a peaceful transition and more a carefully orchestrated coup wrapped in the guise of tradition. The Senate's consent was more coerced than given, a testament to Augustus's political acumen and the Senate's eagerness to cling to its remaining semblance of prestige. In this new imperial system, the Senate retained some administrative duties, such as overseeing Rome's internal affairs and serving as a recruitment pool for bureaucratic positions. But make no mistake, real power now lay with the emperor. The Senate might still debate and vote, but it was largely an exercise in civic theater, a way to maintain a facade of republican governance while the empire's machinery churned on. As we close this chapter, remember that the story of the Senate is far from over. It's a tale of ambition, power, and the inexorable march of history that would echo through the ages. The Senate's decline wasn't a sudden fall from grace, but a gradual erosion of authority in the face of new political realities. And as the Roman Empire rose, the Senate's legacy became a complex tapestry of myth and reality, a reminder that power is as much about perception as it is about control. Stay tuned, because the story of Rome's political evolution is a saga that continues to unfold, with more twists and turns than a Roman chariot race. The Senate's role may have diminished, but its influence on Western political thought endures, a testament to the enduring dance between power, ambition, and the human condition. Yet, as the Roman Empire's sun rose, the Senate's echo lingered, casting shadows over the political landscapes that would follow. Let's fast forward to the present and examine how this ancient institution, with its senatorial swagger and toga-tangled intrigues, still wields influence in today's political systems, albeit with a modern makeover. First, let's tackle the myth of the Roman Senate as the great granddaddy of democracy. In reality, it was more a case of oligarchy with a side of aristocracy. The Senate was an exclusive club for Rome's patrician elite. Flash forward to today, and you'll find that many modern legislative bodies have borrowed this elitist blueprint, albeit with more diversity and slightly less toga. Take the U.S. Senate, for instance, where the concept of a few holding power to represent many echoes Rome's political structure. Sure, today's senators are elected, but the idea of a small group making big decisions, straight out of the Roman playbook. And what about the filibuster, an epic Senate tradition that's less about eloquence and more about endurance? Because who doesn't love a 24-hour speech on the finer points of, say, marmalade tariffs? This procedural tactic has its roots in the Roman penchant for lengthy orations, where a speech could sway the room and halt the political machinery. It's an ironic testament to how some things, like politicians loving the sound of their own voice, never change. But before we get too nostalgic about the Roman Senate's supposed glory days, let's talk economics. Rome's Senate was essentially the world's first financial committee, handling budgets that would make today's billionaires blush. They oversaw the empire's coffers, deciding when to wage war and when to sign peace treaties, often driven by economic gain. Fast forward to today, and you'll see similar financial maneuvers in modern senates, where appropriations and budget bills determine the fate of nations. It turns out that money talks, whether it's in denarii or dollars. Now, we've got to address the elephant, or should I say, the Roman elephant, in the room, the romanticized notion of the Senate as a cradle of fairness and justice. While it's tempting to imagine the Senate as an ancient protector of civic virtue, reality paints a more complicated picture. Yes, the Senate was a crucible for laws and debates, but it was also a venue for power plays and backroom deals. We often celebrate the 12 tables as a triumph of transparency, yet these laws were as much about maintaining control as they were about justice. This duality, the tension between ideals and realpolitik, is a theme that recurs in modern legislative chambers around the world. As we unravel the Senate's legacy, let's not forget the lessons lurking in the margins. The Roman Senate was a master class in political theater. It understood the power of image and perception, leveraging public opinion long before the age of social media. Fast forward to today, and political spin doctors are still crafting narratives with a Roman flair. In modern democracies, the art of persuasion remains a senator's most vital tool, even if the toga has been swapped for a tailored suit. In scrutinizing these narratives, it's crucial to question the stories we've been told about power. The Senate's decline was not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual erosion. As Rome transitioned from republic to empire, the Senate remained a symbol, a reminder of past glories, even as its real power waned. This pattern is a cautionary tale for contemporary politics, where institutions can become ceremonial relics, if not vigilantly maintained. So, what does the Roman Senate teach us about political power today? First, that power is as much about perception as it is about reality. Second, that the structures we build to govern society are fragile, susceptible to the ambitions of charismatic individuals and the shifting tides of economic fortune. Lastly, that while nostalgia offers comfort, it's often a rose-tinted view that glosses over the grit of historical reality. As we wrap up our journey through the Senate's history, remember that this ancient institution's influence persists not just in the mechanics of governance, but in the stories we tell about leadership, responsibility, and ambition. The Senate's legacy is a reminder that the dance of power is eternal, and that understanding the past is key to navigating the present. And there you have it, a tale of intrigue, power, and legacy, woven through the centuries to land squarely in our modern political arena. The Roman Senate stands as both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration, proof that while empires may fall, the ideas they so endure. Keep those lessons close, because history, much like a Roman senator, has a way of repeating itself when you least expect it. The first glimmer of dawn hasn't even thought about stretching across the horizon, and there you are, already up and at M. You, my friend, are a medieval fisherman, and that means your alarm clock is a rooster with an impeccable sense of timing. It's the year 1300, give or take a few, and you're living in a quaint coastal village somewhere in England. The air is brisk, and the smell of salt is your constant companion. Forget snooze buttons. The only snoozing you'll do is when the fish aren't biting. Before your neighbors have even thought about rolling out of their straw-stuffed mattresses, you've pulled on your woolen tunic and worn leather boots. Fashionable, not exactly. Functional, absolutely. Let's be honest, warmth trumps style when you're battling the morning chill. You grab your trusty tools, a couple of nets, a handmade line, and a wooden bucket. These are your lifelines, not just because they catch dinner, because they catch cash. Fishing isn't just a hobby. It's your bread and butter, metaphorically speaking, because actual butter might be too expensive. On average, your earnings might be about 3 pence per day, which isn't exactly rolling in dough. But hey, in an age where a loaf of bread costs around a farthing, you could do worse. Your catch doesn't just feed your family, it keeps the village fed. Without you, everyone's stuck, eating gruel and wishing for something a bit more. Piscine, down at the dark, your boat awaits. It's not a luxury yacht, but a sturdy little vessel that's been patched more times than you can count. You're part sailor, part carpenter. The waterways you navigate aren't exactly the serene blue of holiday brochures. They're more of a murky brown, teeming with fish, yes, but also with the occasional floating log, or worse, a dead sheep from upstream. Superstition. You've got plenty. You might spit over the side of the boat for luck, or whisper a quick prayer to St. Nicholas, patron saint of sailors, just to be sure. You know the sea's as fickle as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Even in calm weather, there's always that lurking possibility of a squall, turning your placid morning into a white-knuckle race for shore. Your fishing techniques are a mix of age-old tradition and sheer desperation. Casting a net, you hope for the best. If the guards are smiling, you'll haul in a fine catch, herring perhaps, or cod if you're lucky. You might even try line fishing, baiting with whatever scraps you've got. It's not elegant, but when it works, it feels like you've struck gold. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of winning the lottery, except instead of millions, you get a few fat fish. While you're out there, let's debunk some myths. We tend to romanticize this life, imagining it's all sea spray and hearty laughs. Reality check. It's back-breaking, bone-chilling work. You're not braving the elements for the love of it. You're doing it because there's rent to pay and mouths to feed. And speaking of romance, those quaint tales of fishermen serenading mermaids. Odds are, any singing you do is more about keeping warm than wooing mythical sea creatures. But here's the kicker. Despite the hardships, your work is vital. The fish you catch are preserved with salt and shipped off to feed not just your village, but towns and cities miles away. In an era with no refrigeration, salt is king, and your catch is the kingdom's bounty. You're not just a fisherman. You're a key player in a supply chain that keeps medieval society afloat, pun intended. By the time the sun's climbing the sky, you've already put in hours of hard graft. And let's not forget, you're dealing with competition. It's not just the other fishermen you're up against. It's the whims of nature itself. Overfishing isn't just a modern problem. Medieval records show that even back then, fish stocks could be alarmingly unpredictable. As you row back to shore with your haul, there's a sense of camaraderie among your fellow fishermen. You swap stories, some true, others less so, while cleaning and sorting the catch. It's a messy, smelly job, but when the fish are plentiful, there's a feeling of triumph. Only now can you start thinking about breakfast, which might just be a bit of last night's pottage heated up over the hearth. The day's not over yet, but already you've faced the elements, navigated treacherous waters, and brought home the proverbial bacon, or in your case, fish. It's a life of routine, yes, but also of resilience and resourcefulness. And as you sit down to your meal, you might just allow yourself a moment's satisfaction. You've earned it. But don't get too comfortable. Tomorrow, it all begins again. But don't get too comfortable. Tomorrow, it all begins again. And let's talk a bit about where you stand in this medieval society of ours. You, my friend, aren't exactly the rock star of the medieval economy, but you're not the roadie either. As a fisherman, you find yourself somewhere in the middle, an essential cog in the socio-economic machine, but not quite the one receiving standing ovations at the village fair. In medieval England, your social standing is like being the bassist in a band, crucial yet often overshadowed by the lead guitarists, who in this analogy are the merchants and landowners. Fishermen were part of the working class, and while you didn't have the clout of a wealthy merchant or the influence of a knight, you were far from the bottom rungs. You provided a vital service, food, and in an age where famine was as common as a cold, that made you indispensable. Now, you weren't exactly rubbing elbows with the nobility, but you did have interactions with other tradespeople. You might find yourself bartering fish for goods with the local blacksmith, or trading tales of the sea with a carpenter who helps patch up your boat. The village was a bustling hub of interconnected trades, each relying on the other, a medieval linked-in, if you will, but with more mud and fewer endorsements. When it came to guilds, though, fishermen were a bit of an anomaly. You see, most skilled tradesmen, your blacksmiths, weavers, and masons, were part of guilds, which were like medieval trade unions with a side of fraternity and a dash of monopoly. These guilds controlled trade, set quality standards, and often had significant political influence. But fishermen, you were more of a free spirit, not as tightly bound by guild rules. This autonomy was both a blessing and a curse. You had more freedom but less protection and bargaining power. Speaking of politics, let's dive into the murky waters of medieval bureaucracy. Taxes were the medieval equivalent of a pop quiz, unexpected and deeply unwelcome. Fishermen were often subject to various levies, such as the tithe, where a tenth of your catch went to the church. Add to that the local lord's cut, and suddenly your hard-earned fish are vanishing faster than a rabbit at a wizard's convention. And if you think tax season is rough now, imagine navigating the labyrinthine regulations of the Middle Ages. Fishing rights were often granted by local authorities, and these could be as fickle as a medieval monarch's favor. Navigating this bureaucratic minefield required a certain savvy, and many fishermen resorted to what we might call creative accounting today. Now, I'm not saying every fisherman was a rogue accountant, but let's just say there was a lot of fishy math going on. Underreporting catches, bribing officials with a nice fat card, or simply fishing in forbidden waters and hoping not to get caught. These were common practices. It was like playing a game of medieval cat and mouse, except the mouse had a net full of fish, and the cat was wearing a crown and demanding tribute. And here's where it gets juicy. These under-the-table dealings were practically an open secret. Everyone knew what was going on, from the local lord to the village priest. But as long as the church got its tithe, and the lord received his dues, a blind eye was often turned. After all, the system was as much about maintaining the status quo as it was about enforcing the law. In this tangled web of taxes and regulations, fishermen learned to be as shrewd as they were skilled with a net. They had to be. With a political climate as volatile as the English Channel during a storm, adaptability was the name of the game. And as much as we might romanticize the notion of the rugged fisherman braving the elements, the reality was a complex dance of survival, strategy, and sometimes downright cunning. Despite these challenges, there was a certain camaraderie among fishermen that transcended social status. You might not have a fancy title or lands to your name, but you had the respect of your peers and the knowledge that you were an integral part of the community. In a world where social mobility was as rare as a unicorn sighting, that was no small accomplishment. As you sit there, perhaps mulling over a pint of ale at the local tavern, you reflect on your place in this grand tapestry of medieval life. Sure, you're not a lord or a merchant prince, but you're not a peasant either. You're a fisherman, and while that might not come with the glamour or the riches, it does come with a sense of purpose. You're feeding the village, contributing to the economy, and doing it all with a resilience that would make even the toughest knight nod in respect. And that, dear friend, is no small thing. As the flickering candlelight dances on the tavern walls, you raise your mug in a silent toast to tomorrow. Because despite the challenges, the bureaucracy, and the unpredictability of the sea, there's a certain satisfaction in knowing that you've carved out a niche for yourself in this medieval world. Just remember to keep your accounts as tidy as your nets, and maybe, just maybe, you'll stay one step ahead of the taxman, or at least keep him well fed enough to look the other way. Stay tuned, because the tides of medieval life are far from finished with you. There are more fish to catch, more tales to tell, and more myths to unravel. And who knows, tomorrow might just be the day you reel in the catch of a lifetime, or at least enough to keep the village talking for a while. So rest up, because as sure as the sun will rise, there's another day waiting just beyond the horizon, full of promise, challenges, and the occasional surprise. Keep your wits about you, and you'll do just fine. So, as you sit there, sipping your ale and pondering the tides of medieval life, let's break down this whole romantic notion of the solitary, carefree fisherman. It's a story as old as time, or at least as old as poets trying to sell books. Picture the classic image. A lone mariner, the wind in his hair, the vast open sea, and the promise of adventure. Sounds appealing, right? Well, hold onto your card piece, because reality is about to crash this party like a medieval drunkard at a wedding feast. First off, the idea of solitude is about as realistic as a unicorn in a jousting tournament. Sure, you might start your day alone, but out on the water, you're never really by yourself. The sea is a bustling metropolis of fish, birds, and the occasional seal giving you a judgmental side-eye. Plus, your fellow fishermen are never too far away, sharing the same waters, and sometimes the same net. Forget about me time. This is a community affair. And then there's the notion of freedom. Ah, the open sea, where one can sail away from the burdens of life. Except, spoiler alert, you're not a pirate with a penchant for plunder. You're a fisherman with a family to feed and a tithe to pay. Your freedom is shackled by the relentless demands of the market, the church, and the local lord. In fact, your daily existence is more about dodging economic shipwrecks than chasing personal liberation. Now, let's talk about the real dangers of this gig. Your average day involves more peril than a knight's quest, minus the shiny armor for protection. Drowning was a very real threat. No life jackets here, just your wits and a prayer. And if a freak wave doesn't get you, maybe the weather will. Medieval meteorology was less about predicting the future and more about surviving the present. Storms could roll in faster than a barmaid with a fresh round of ale, leaving you clinging to your boat and hoping today isn't the day you meet Davy Jones. Let's not forget the health risks. Ever heard of the term fisherman's cough? That's the polite way of saying you've inhaled so much salty air and fishy stench that your lungs are practically pickled. The cold, damp environment is a breeding ground for ailments, rheumatism, frostbite, and the occasional bout of scurvy, when fruits and veggies are as rare as a good hair day in a medieval portrait. Your immune system is like a medieval fortress, constantly under siege. And here's a fun fact to chew on: the social stigma attached to your profession. You'd think bringing home the bacon, or in this case the herring, would earn you some respect. But no, fishermen were often seen as rough around the edges, a bit too salty for polite society's taste. You might be essential to the village survival, but don't expect an invitation to the Lord's banquet anytime soon. Your hands smell like fish, your clothes are perpetually damp, and your language is as colourful as a tapestry, none of which endear you to the gentry. But let's return to that myth of the romantic fisherman, the rugged individualist, the master of his own destiny. It's a compelling narrative, isn't it? The truth, however, is that your destiny is more often dictated by the tides and the market. Overfishing isn't just a modern woe. Medieval records show fluctuating fish stocks were a constant worry long before Greenpeace came along. The sea giveth, and the sea taketh away, often without so much as a courtesy note. And economically, you're caught in a net of your own. Your income is as unpredictable as the weather, fluctuating with each catch, season, and market demand. One day you're rolling in herring, the next you're scraping by with a few sad sprats. And let's not forget the taxes. Did I mention those? Right, but it bears repeating, because they're an ever-present shadow over your shoulder, lightening your load just when you think you've got a good haul. So why do it? Why endure the hardships, the dangers, the social snubs? Because despite everything, there's a certain nobility in the struggle. You're not just fishing for survival. You're fishing for identity, for community, for a purpose larger than the individual. In a world where options are limited, and fate is often a roll of the dice, being a fisherman means you're part of something bigger. You feed the people, sustain the village, and in your own way, you're a guardian of a tradition that has persisted through the ages. As you finish your ale, pondering these truths, you might just allow yourself a wry smile. The myths may be half-truths, but they're not without their charm. And deep down, perhaps you even embrace them, if only to make the daily grind a little more bearable. Tomorrow, the sea awaits with all its mysteries and challenges. You'll face it head-on, not because you wear rose-tinted glasses, but because you've seen the reality and chosen to embrace it anyway. So, raise your mug to the myths and the realities, the romance and the hardship. Because in this medieval world, they're as intertwined as the nets you cast each day. And who knows, maybe tomorrow you'll catch something more than fish, a glimpse of that storied freedom, a moment of solitude, or just another tale to tell. Whatever it is, it'll be yours, earned through grit and determination, and that's worth a toast any day. As you finish your ale, mulling over the intertwining myths and realities of your fisherman's life, let's pivot to what happens when you're not braving the elements or dodging taxes. Believe it or not, being a medieval fisherman isn't just about the high seas and haggling for a decent price on your catch. Nope, there's a whole world back on dry land that's just as demanding and perhaps even more complex. Living conditions for you and your family are about as luxurious as a monk's vow of poverty. Your home is a modest affair, usually a single-room cottage made of wattle and daub, a fancy way of saying sticks and mud, with a thatched roof that's more hole than hat. Insulation, not unless you count the family pigs snuggling up for warmth. Floors are dirt, literally, with the occasional straw covering if you're feeling fancy. And let's not mince words. Sanitation is as basic as it gets. A chamber pot is your best friend, and the great outdoors your waste disposal system. Yet, it's these humble homes that form the backbone of your community. Everyone's in the same boat, so to speak. You live cheek by jowl with your fellow villagers, making it easy to share resources, gossip, and the occasional cup of diluted ale. Your sense of community isn't just for show, it's a survival tactic. In times of poor catches or harsh winters, neighbors band together. You might trade fish for firewood or help mend a roof in exchange for a loaf of barley bread. It's a primitive form of social security, but it works. Family roles are as defined as a medieval manuscript. As the head of the household, your job is to provide the proverbial bread and butter, though as we've covered, butter's a luxury. Your spouse, meanwhile, is the executive officer of the domestic front. She's managing the hearth, tending a small garden, raising the kids, and maybe even trading in the local market. Her role is crucial, and while she might not be launching boats, she's certainly keeping the home shipshape. Children, they're not just adorable distractions. They're pint-sized laborers in training. As soon as they're old enough to pull a fish line or weed a garden, they're contributing to the family economy. Forget about schooling. Learning is hands-on, and the curriculum is survival. If you're lucky, one of the local monks might teach the basics of reading and writing, but that's more the exception than the rule. Community support systems are your lifeline, and they go beyond just neighborly favors. Take the church, for example. It's not just a place for Sunday sermons, but a community hub. The church is where you get your spiritual guidance, sure, but it's also where you catch up on village news and perhaps grab a bit of charity in lean times. The church's tithe might feel like a thorn in your side, but it also funds alms for the poor and hosts communal feasts during religious festivals. It's the medieval version of a social network, and while it might not be as glamorous as a Facebook profile, it's far more vital. The seasons and weather dictate your life like a tyrannical boss with a penchant for chaos. Winter is harsh, reducing fishing to sporadic ventures when the weather permits. The sea is unpredictable, freezing your hands and testing the limits of your woolen tunic. Spring ushers in a sense of renewal as the waters warm and fish stocks rebound. Summer is your busiest season, with long days spent at sea trying to make up for those lean winter months. Autumn brings harvest festivals and the looming dread of winter's return. Cultural and religious practices are interwoven into your daily routine. Feast days and saints' days pepper the calendar, offering much-needed breaks from the grind. St. Peter, the fisherman's patron saint, gets a nod on his feast day with a special service and perhaps a communal meal. Lent, with its fasting and abstinence, might seem like a curse for a fisherman. Less fish, more penance. But it also signals the approach of Easter and better fishing weather. Speaking of religion, here's an anecdote to tickle your historical fancy. In the 12th century, Hildegard of Bingen, a Benedictine abbess, wrote about the spiritual significance of fish, likening their movement in water to the soul's journey through life. Her writings influenced not just religious thought, but also how fish were viewed in medieval society, not just as food, but as symbols of sustenance and spirituality. Let's debunk another myth while we're at it, the notion that medieval villagers were simple folk with no concept of time. True, you're not wearing a Rolex, but the village church bell is your timekeeper, marking the hours with a regularity that could put modern clocks to shame. You plan your day around these chimes, from morning prayers to evening rest. Seasons and celestial events also guide your activities, with solstices and equinoxes marking transitions in your work patterns. In terms of social dynamics, fishermen are part of a larger tapestry of village life. You rub shoulders with blacksmiths, bakers, and maybe even the odd traveling merchant. The village market is your social media platform, a place to exchange goods, news, and the occasional scandal. Here, haggling is an art form, and your skills in negotiation are as crucial as those in fishing. Everyone knows everyone else's business, and while that might seem claustrophobic, it also means support is just a shout away. Community celebrations are the highlights of your year. Harvest festivals, saints' days, and the occasional wedding or christening break the monotony with music, dance, and food. These occasions are more than just parties. They're a reaffirmation of community bonds, a chance to strengthen alliances and forge new friendships. You might even get to enjoy a bit of roasted meat, a luxury that makes the endless meals of fish seem less monotonous. Let's not forget the role of folklore and superstition in your life. The sea is full of mysteries, and tales of sea monsters or enchanted islands keep you wary. Superstitions abound, from avoiding certain colors on your boat to never mentioning rabbits, a word that supposedly brings bad luck. These beliefs might seem quaint, but they serve as coping mechanisms in a world where much is beyond your control. As you sit by the fire, perhaps mending a net with your family gathered around, you reflect on the intricate web of community and family life that supports you. It's not a glamorous existence, but it's rich in purpose and connection. As you prepare for another day on the water, you're reminded that being a medieval fisherman isn't just a job. It's a way of life, deeply rooted in the rhythms of nature and the bonds of community. So, raise your mug again, this time to the unsung heroes of your life, the family members, neighbors, and community leaders who make the daily grind not just bearable, but meaningful. You're part of a tapestry that's been woven over centuries, each thread a story of resilience, cooperation, and shared humanity. And as you drift off to sleep, the promise of another day, another catch, and another story to tell lulls you into dreams as rich and varied as the life you lead. And now, as you drift off to sleep, let's take a moment to ponder the legacy of those medieval fishermen. Fast forward a few centuries, and the humble fisherman's role has cast a long and enduring shadow. You might think of them as the unsung heroes of the Middle Ages, but their contributions ripple through time like, well, the waves they once braved. Let's dive into how their practices evolved. By the late medieval period, fishing techniques had started to change, and not just because someone decided that nets should have fewer holes than Swiss cheese. The introduction of the herring buss in the 15th century was a game-changer. This larger, more robust vessel allowed fishermen to venture further from shore and stay at sea longer, an early version of the go big or go home strategy. With more room for preservation methods like pickling and salting, the herring buss turned fishing from a local affair into an international enterprise. And speaking of preservation, remember that salt we mentioned. By the 14th century, salt had become as valuable as gold for fishermen. It was the medieval equivalent of refrigeration and an indispensable part of the booming fish industry. This salty treasure allowed medieval fishermen to extend the life of their catch and expand their market reach far beyond the village. It was a win-win. Fish stayed fresh, and fishermen's pockets grew slightly less empty. Now, let's talk about what remains today. Those medieval fishermen were pioneers of a global supply chain, long before globalization became a buzzword. Their legacy lives on in the fishing practices we know today, even if modern technology has swapped wooden boats for steel trawlers and nets for sonar. But the core principles, sustainability, adaptation, and community, echo through the ages. While technology has advanced, the essence of fishing remains as it always has been, a dance with nature, full of risk and reward. But what about the enduring fascination with fishing, both necessity and leisure? Well, humanity's relationship with fishing is like a long-term romance, sometimes stormy, often rewarding, and always essential. From the Middle Ages to modern times, fishing has been a staple of survival and a beloved pastime. Today, recreational fishing is a billion-dollar industry, showing that the appeal of casting a line hasn't waned, even if the stakes are no longer life and death. How has this dance with the sea shaped societies throughout history? Oh, let me count the ways. Fishing has fed nations, driven economies, and even sparked conflict. The card wars between the UK and Iceland in the 20th century serve as a salty reminder that fish can be as contentious as they are delicious. These disputes over fishing rights highlight the economic and political importance of the industry, proving that fish are serious business. Yet, let's not forget the cultural weight fishing carries. It's not just about sustenance, it's about identity, stories, and tradition. From Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea to the countless fishing tales told around campfires and kitchen tables, fishing is woven into the human narrative. It's a reminder of our primal connection to nature and a testament to our perseverance. In the end, the story of medieval fishermen is a tale of grit, survival, and legacy. They weren't just pulling fish from the sea, they were weaving the fabric of society, one catch at a time. So, next time you enjoy a seafood dinner or cast a line into the water, tip your hat to the medieval fishermen who paved the way. Because in the grand tapestry of history, they left a mark as indelible as the tides themselves. And there you have it, a legacy as enduring as the sea's eternal ebb and flow. The medieval fishermen may not have known the future impact of their work, but they set the stage for centuries of maritime adventure. So, as you snuggle under the covers and drift into dreams of sea spray and sunlight, remember that history isn't just about grand battles and famous kings. Sometimes, It's about the everyday heroes who cast their nets into the unknown and reeled in the future. Sleep tight, and may your dreams be as rich and wondrous as the ocean depths. Welcome to the medieval justice system, where the motto seemed to be, why settle for fairness when you can have a good stretch? Few symbols of medieval brutality capture the imagination like the infamous rack, a device that made bodybuilders envious with its ability to lengthen limbs. But let's not get ahead of ourselves with romantic notions of dark dungeons and shadowy figures. The rack was as much about intimidation and control as it was about extracting confessions, which were often about as truthful as a politician's campaign promise. First things first, let's talk mechanics. Picture a wooden frame, roughly the size of a twin bed, with rollers at both ends. You'd be strapped down by your wrists and ankles, and with a few cranks of the handle, voila! Your body would start doing its best impression of a human taffy pull. This wasn't just a simple DIY project for your local blacksmith. This was a carefully crafted instrument of persuasion, designed to make you sing like a canary, whether you knew the lyrics or not. Now, let's talk numbers. In today's currency, constructing one of these medieval marvels would set you back around $20,000. That's a hefty price tag for a device that's essentially a wooden frame with some rope and gears. But back in the day, it was an investment in maintaining the status quo. It was a tool of the state, a flashy way to show who's in charge, and to remind the masses that dissent had a very literal cost. But why was the rack such a crowd favorite among medieval torturers? The answer isn't as simple as because it worked. In fact, the effectiveness of the rack in getting to the truth was about as reliable as a weatherman's forecast. More often than not, it resulted in confessions that were coerced rather than truthful. So why bother? It's all about power. The rack was a tool of terror, a public relations campaign for the ruling class. It demonstrated the reach and the ruthlessness of authority, serving as a potent reminder to anyone tempted to step out of line. In the grand scheme of medieval justice, the rack was less about uncovering hidden truths and more about reinforcing the status quo. The rack was the ultimate conversation into the because I said so of its time. If you found yourself on it, you knew the conversation was over, and the only thing left to do was talk. Let's debunk a myth while we're at it. Torture devices like the rack aren't just figments of Hollywood's imagination. They weren't used in every trial or for every petty crime. These were reserved for the cases that mattered to the powers that be heresy, treason, and other serious offenses that threatened the very fabric of medieval society. The rack was the nuclear option in a torturer's toolkit, used sparingly but with great effect. And while the image of the rack may evoke scenes of shadowy dungeons, the reality was often much more mundane. Torture was a bureaucratic affair, complete with paperwork and legal proceedings. It wasn't just the dark corners of castles that saw these devices in action. They were often used in the light of day, in public view, to maximize their psychological impact. In the twisted logic of medieval justice, the rack's purpose was less about the individual on the device and more about the audience. It was a spectacle meant to reinforce the power structure and remind everyone watching that stepping out of line had painful consequences. It was the medieval equivalent of a public service announcement, albeit one with a much more gruesome punchline. In conclusion, the rack was more than just a tool of torture. It was a symbol of authority, control, and power. It was a reminder that in the medieval world, the truth was often less important than maintaining order, and nothing maintained order quite like the threat of being stretched beyond your limits. So, with the rack setting the stage for a medieval morality play, let's turn our spotlight to two other stars of the torture circuit, the branding iron and the pillory. These weren't just tools of medieval justice. They were the ultimate in public humiliation, sort of medieval version of reality TV that everyone could enjoy, minus the ad breaks and confessional interviews. First up, the branding iron. Now, if the rack was the Rolls-Royce of medieval torture devices, the branding iron was more like the economy car. Simple, effective, and oh so cost-efficient. For a meager sum, you could have a piece of iron heated to a toasty 600 degrees Fahrenheit and pressed against the skin of your choice, or rather, the choice of the local authorities. Branding was the medieval equivalent of leaving a one-star review on Yelp, only the feedback was a little more permanent. Let's talk logistics. Branding irons were cheap, sturdy, and easy to use. You could whip one up for the medieval equivalent of pocket change, making them a crowd favorite for those looking to dish out justice on a budget. These fiery tools left a mark that was both literal and social, transforming your forearm into a billboard of your crimes. Talk about wearable tech. But the branding iron wasn't just a tool of pain, it was a tool of public relations. The marks left behind were badges of shame that announced your misdeeds to the world. Imagine trying to swipe right on your old Tinder with a giant T for thief emblazoned on your cheek. It was the medieval version of a scarlet letter, ensuring that your social stock plummeted faster than a medieval stock exchange crash, if such a thing existed. Now, onto the pillory, the medieval town square's answer to the morning talk show. For those not in the know, the pillory was a wooden framework with holes for securing the head and hands. Once locked in, the offender was left standing, because comfort was clearly not a priority, while the local populace threw whatever they had on hand, be it rotten vegetables, stones, or whatever insults they could hurl. Imagine the world's worst game of dodgeball, but with significantly higher stakes. The beauty of the pillory, if you could call it that, lay in its simplicity and economic genius. All you needed was a few planks of wood and a crowd hungry for entertainment. It turned justice into a participatory sport, where everyone got a chance to play judge, jury, and tomato thrower. You didn't even have to buy a ticket. It was free entertainment for all ages. And let's be honest, in the days before Netflix, a good public shaming was the hardest show in town. But there's more to this story than just public humiliation. The pillory was a social equalizer of sorts, where anyone from a petty thief to a disgraced noble could find themselves in the same awkward, uncomfortable position. It was a reminder that no matter your status, the consequences of breaking the law were the same. A sore neck, and a bruised ego. The pillory was a great leveler, making everyone involved question the real cost of their actions. Fast forward to today, and you might see some reflections of the pillory in modern-day social media shaming. Just swap the rotten tomatoes for scathing tweets, and you've got yourself a 21st century version of public punishment. The internet has become a digital pillory, where reputations can be bruised and battered in the time it takes to type 280 characters. It's a reminder that while the tools have changed, the human penchant for public humiliation remains alive and well. So, what does this all say about medieval society? Well, it's clear that punishment wasn't just about justice. It was about spectacle. The branding iron and the pillory were not merely methods of correction, but a form of medieval reality TV, with a captive audience and a clear message. Step out of line, and you'll find yourself the star of a show you definitely didn't audition for. In the grand hierarchy of medieval justice, these instruments served as stark reminders that maintaining social order often meant turning punishment into theatre. They were affordable, accessible, and effective in keeping the local populace in check, all while providing a bit of live entertainment. Because let's face it, in a time before streaming services, a good public shaming was worth more than the price of admission. As we peel back the layers of history, it's evident that the medieval world was as much about social dynamics as it was about law and order. The branding iron and the pillory were tools not just of punishment, but of community engagement, bringing people together in a shared experience of public humiliation, a dark, twisted version of community service. So the next time you scroll through a social media feed full of digital shaming, remember, the pillory may be long gone, but its spirit lives on, reminding us that while technology changes, human nature seems to have a penchant for staying the same. And there you have it, a closer look at how medieval justice wasn't just about the brute force of the rack, but the subtle artistry of public humiliation. As we continue our dive into the world of medieval torture, remember to take everything with a grain of salt, and maybe a rotten tomato or two. Now that we've waded through the public theatre of the pillory and branding iron, let's dive into the more sinister corners of medieval punishment, the Iron Maiden and the Scavenger's Daughter. These devices are the rock stars of medieval torture lore, etched into the collective imagination with a mix of horror and fascination. But as with any good legend, the truth is often murkier than the myths that surround them. First up, the Iron Maiden. Now, before you start picturing a heavy metal band logo, let's get into what this contraption allegedly was. Legend has it that the Iron Maiden was a tall, coffin-like cabinet lined with spikes, designed to embrace its victim in a deadly hug. Open it, park your unfortunate guest inside, and close the door to punctuate the end of their story, literally. But here's the kicker. The first recorded mention of an Iron Maiden wasn't until the 18th century, long after the medieval period had packed up its torture tools and moved on. So, was it a medieval invention or an 18th century fabrication? The jury's out, but historical documentation suggests it was more of a cautionary tale than a real fixture in the dungeons of old. In fact, the Iron Maiden may have been more about scaring the living daylights out of people than actually being used. Why build a spiky death box when you could just tell everyone you had one? It's the medieval equivalent of a nuclear deterrent. Threatening its presence was often more effective than deploying it. The psychological power of the Iron Maiden lay in its terrifying potential. After all, what's scarier than the idea of a slow, spiked embrace? It's like your worst hug nightmare come to life. This chilling concept served as a grim reminder of the consequences of defying authority, whether the device ever saw actual use or not. Now, let's switch gears to the Scavenger's Daughter, a device as uncomfortably intriguing as its name suggests. Unlike its more famous sibling, the rack, which stretched you out, the Scavenger's Daughter had the opposite effect. It was all about compression. Invented by Sir Leonard Skeffington, you can almost hear the Monty Python sketch riding itself. This diabolical contraption consisted of a metal hoop that folded the body into an excruciating crouch. Imagine being crammed into an invisible suitcase with no room to move. In a world where stretching was the name of the torture game, Skeffington's innovation was to see just how small he could make you. The Scavenger's Daughter wasn't just a physical torture device, it was a mental game too. The compression and confinement played a psychological trick, turning the victim's own body against them as they struggled for space and air. And let's not forget the audience. Watching someone folded into an origami of agony was a sobering sight, driving home the message that even the most rebellious spirit could be crushed under the weight of the crown. But here's where things get interesting. Much like the Iron Maiden, the real use of the Scavenger's Daughter is up for debate. Historical records of its actual application are scarce, leading some to believe it was more about the threat than the act. It's like the haunted house at the end of the street. Most people never walk up the driveway, but the stories keep them away. The mere idea of such a device was a powerful tool in maintaining order, instilling fear of what could happen if you found yourself on the wrong side of the law. What's fascinating here is how these devices highlight the dual nature of medieval justice. On one hand, you have the actual application of law and order, where tools like the rack were used to extract confessions, true or otherwise. On the other hand, you have the psychological warfare. The mere existence of devices like the Iron Maiden and the Scavenger's Daughter served as a chilling deterrent, ensuring that the power of the state was omnipresent and omnipotent. It's a testament to the effectiveness of myth as a method of control. The legends of these devices outlasted the reality, embedding themselves in the psyche of society as symbols of ultimate authority. Sure, the Iron Maiden might not have been wielded with the regularity of a medieval tax collector, but its spectre loomed large in the public consciousness. It's a potent reminder that sometimes the idea of punishment can be more terrifying than the act itself. So, as we peer into the dark heart of medieval justice, let's remember that the tools of torture were as much about perception as they were about pain. Whether through the physical contortions of the Scavenger's Daughter or the looming threat of the Iron Maiden, the message was clear. Challenge the system, and you'll find yourself at the mercy of devices that blur the line between legend and reality. And while the medieval world may have moved on, the echoes of these devices remain, reminding us that fear can be a powerful tool in the hands of those who wield it. As we continue to unravel the tangled web of medieval justice, keep in mind that each tale, whether rooted in fact or fiction, has something to teach us about the human condition. From the twisted metal of the Scavenger's Daughter to the imposing silhouette of the Iron Maiden, these stories are a testament to the lengths people will go to maintain control and the psychological scars that linger long after the devices themselves have rusted away. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the murky depths of history, exploring how these grim tales continue to shape our understanding of power, fear, and the eternal struggle for justice. Speaking of power in the hands of rulers, let's not forget that medieval torture was more than an exercise in sadism. It was a political tool wielded with surgical precision. Monarchs and rulers weren't just sitting on golden thrones, twiddling their thumbs. They were strategists with a penchant for using fear as a leash to keep their kingdoms in check. Torture was not just a tool of punishment. It was a calculated move on the chessboard of power. Picture a medieval ruler deciding whether to deploy the rack, much like a general deciding whether to deploy the cavalry. These decisions had ripple effects that reached far beyond the dungeon walls. Take the infamous case of Richard Tarpcliffe, a name that might not mean much to your average dinner guest today, but was once synonymous with the grim business of state-sanctioned brutality. Tarpcliffe was Queen Elizabeth as got a guy for dealing with pesky Catholic priests during the Protestant Reformation. Think of him as the medieval equivalent of a fixer, except instead of dealing with scandals, he dealt with souls. His methods were so infamous that he became a bogeyman figure in his own right. In his hands, the rack and the scavenger's daughter became instruments of religious and political control, sending a clear message: defy the crown, and you'll get a personal tour of the tower's least friendly amenities. But here's where it gets intriguing. Tarpcliffe wasn't just a fanatical torturer on a one-man crusade. He was a state employee, a cog in the grand machinery of Elizabethan politics. His salary was a paltry £20 a year, roughly equivalent to $5,000 today. Hardly the kind of paycheck you'd expect for someone who could strike fear into the hearts of an entire religious community. Yet, the impact of his work was worth far more than his wages. His services were invaluable to the crown, demonstrating just how economically efficient fear could be when properly harnessed. The economic implications of torture extend beyond mere salaries. Maintaining a system of torture wasn't just about paying the guy with the thumbscrews. It was about managing a whole infrastructure. The cost of maintaining dungeons, paying guards, and constructing devices like the rack or the Iron Maiden was significant, but rulers like Elizabeth I understood it was an investment in stability. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of spending on national defense, except instead of missiles and tanks, you had branding irons and pillories. And let's not overlook the social standing of torturers themselves. While they might not have been the toast of the town, they held a peculiar position in society. On the one hand, they were feared and reviled. On the other, they were necessary, much like the town executioner. In some twisted way, their work was seen as a dark form of public service. Torturers were the guardians of law and order, ensuring that the king's peace was maintained, even if it meant resorting to unspeakable acts. It was a grim but effective reminder that the state had teeth and wasn't afraid to bare them. This brings us to the broader socio-political landscape. Torture wasn't just about punishing the individual. It was about sending a message to the collective. When a noble was put to the rack for treason, it wasn't just about getting a confession. It was about demonstrating the reach of the crown's power. The economic cost of this system was offset by the political benefits, compliance, control, and the occasional coerced confession that could be paraded as validation of the monarch's divine right to rule. Economic efficiency aside, the political utility of torture was also about optics. The spectacle of public punishment served as a potent deterrent, reinforcing the idea that the state was omnipotent and omnipresent. It was a show of strength, a reminder that while the king might seem distant and benevolent, he was always just one misstep away from making an example out of you. But let's not romanticize it too much. The reality was as brutal as it sounds. Torture was a raw, unfiltered display of power, a grim dance of dominance and submission. It wasn't just about extracting information. It was about breaking spirits and bending wills. The legends of devices like the Iron Maiden and the Scavenger's Daughter are compelling, but they mask the very real suffering that was inflicted in the name of law and order. In the twisted hierarchy of medieval justice, the torturer was both a tool and a weapon. They were the enforcers of a brutal system that valued order over truth and control over compassion. And while we might like to think we're more civilized today, the echoes of this system can still be heard in modern debates about power and punishment. The methods may have evolved, but the underlying dynamics remain eerily familiar. So, what does this all say about the medieval world? It reminds us that power isn't just about might, it's about perception. The political use of torture was as much about reinforcing the image of an unassailable authority as it was about maintaining the status quo. It was a dark, twisted kind of theatre, one that played out in dungeons and town squares across Europe. And while the curtain has long since fallen on this particular act of history, the lessons it offers about the nature of power and control are as relevant today as they were centuries ago. As we continue to delve into this murky past, keep in mind that each story, each case, offers a glimpse into the complexities of human governance. From the economic calculations that justified the cost of torture to the political strategies that wielded it as a weapon, these tales are a testament to the dark intricacies of maintaining power. So stay tuned, because the world of medieval justice still has a few more secrets to reveal before the show is over. As the medieval curtain finally falls on this grand, gruesome theatre of justice, let's take a moment to reflect on the decline of these brutal practices and the surprising leaps forward in the evolution of judicial systems. It's like watching a horror movie that abruptly shifts into a courtroom drama, where the real action is in the battle of wits rather than the rack. Enter the Enlightenment, the intellectual movement that swept through Europe in the late 17th and 18th centuries like a breath of fresh air, or maybe a blast of common sense. Enlightenment thinkers were the original mythbusters, challenging the status quo with the radical notion that torture might not be the best way to run a justice system. Names like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Beccaria became the rock stars of rational thought, advocating for a legal framework that valued reason over retribution. Cesare Beccaria, in particular, deserves a standing ovation for his groundbreaking work on crimes and punishments, published in 1764. Beccaria argued that the purpose of punishment should be to prevent crime, not to exact revenge. This was revolutionary, like suggesting a medieval feast could be enjoyed without a side of plague. He proposed that punishment should be proportionate to the crime, swift and certain, essentially laying the groundwork for modern criminal justice systems. It was like telling a medieval torturer to trade in their thumbscrews for a gavel. And while we're at it, let's not forget the economic angle. The cost of maintaining a system of torture was hefty, not just in terms of finances, but also in terms of public trust, as monarchs and governments realized that ruling through fear was a shaky long-term strategy. They began to see the value in a more humane approach. It turns out that citizens are less likely to revolt if they are not in constant fear of being stretched like medieval taffy. So, what did this shift look like in practice? Well, for one, the use of torture as a judicial tool started to wane by the late 18th century. Countries across Europe began to abolish torture, with Prussia leading the charge in 1740, followed by Sweden and France. By the early 19th century, torture had all but disappeared from the legal landscape, replaced by a system that at least nodded in the direction of fairness and due process. Of course, this isn't to say that everything became sunshine and daisies overnight. The transition was as bumpy as a medieval cart ride. Old habits die hard, and the judicial systems of the time had to work through centuries of entrenched practices. But the important thing is that the wheels of progress were finally turning, creaky as they were. So, with the decline of torture, what myths are we left with today? The image of medieval justice, complete with shadowy dungeons and sadistic torturers, still looms large in our collective imagination. It's the stuff of legends, movies, and Halloween costumes, but it's a far cry from the often bureaucratic and mundane reality. The myth is appealing because it simplifies a complex and murky past into a narrative we can easily digest, one where the bad guys wear black and the good guys eventually triumph. Yet, these myths also serve as a reminder of humanity's darker impulses. They highlight the thin line between justice and cruelty and the ease with which power can corrupt. In a way, they're cautionary tales about the potential for abuse inherent in any system, past or present. The tools and methods have changed, but the human penchant for control and dominance remains a constant through the ages. Fast forward to today, and the spectre of medieval torture still casts a long shadow, influencing how we perceive justice and punishment. Modern debates about the death penalty, prison reform, and human rights continue to echo the questions first raised during the Enlightenment. The legacy of medieval justice, is a complex tapestry of progress and regression, a reminder that every step forward is often accompanied by a glance backward. In conclusion, the decline of medieval torture practices and the evolution of judicial systems are not just chapters in a history book, but ongoing stories that continue to shape our world. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and humanity over cruelty and fear was a significant turning point, one that laid the groundwork for modern concepts of justice. So next time you're watching a medieval drama or reading about the Iron Maiden, remember, while the myths are captivating, the reality is far richer and more complex. And there you have it, a journey through the twisted corridors of medieval justice, with a few sharp turns and enlightening discoveries along the way. As the final credits roll on this historical saga, let's take with us the lessons learned and the knowledge that history, with all its dark corners, can still illuminate the present. Keep questioning, keep challenging, and above all, keep seeking the truth, because, as we've seen, it's often stranger and more fascinating than fiction.